Section 1. The beginning of everything. How Family Guy was born. There's something almost mythological about the way certain shows come into existence. Most of them don't arrive fully formed from the mind of some studio executive sitting in a glass tower. The good ones, the ones that actually last, that actually mean something, usually come from one person, alone, with a pencil and an idea they couldn't shake. Family Guy is one of those shows, and the story of how it got made is one of the strangest, most improbable origin stories in the history of American television. Let's go back to the beginning, not 1999, when the show first aired, not 1998, when the pitch happened. We're going further back than that. We're going to a small art school in Providence, Rhode Island, sometime in the early 1990s. The Rhode Island School of Design, RISD, if you want to sound like you belong there, is one of the most respected art and design schools in the entire country. It's the kind of place where the buildings smell like paint thinner and ambition, where students stay up until 3 in the morning arguing about composition and color theory. It's not a place you'd normally associate with a raucous, adult, animated comedy about a dysfunctional family in a fictional Rhode Island town, but that's where it all started. A young man named Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was studying animation there. He was born on the 26th of October, 1973, in Kent, Connecticut, which is one of those small New England towns that seems designed to produce people with a very particular type of sensibility. A little literary, a little sardonic, quietly proud of being from somewhere nobody else has heard of. MacFarlane had been drawing cartoons since he was a child. He published his own comic strip in a local paper when he was 9 years old. This wasn't a hobby or a phase. This was his entire identity, concentrated and pointed at a single destination from the moment he was old enough to hold a pen. At RISD, MacFarlane was working on his thesis film. Every student in an art program has to produce one, a final piece that represents what they've learned and, more importantly, what they're capable of. For most students, a thesis film is a source of considerable anxiety. For MacFarlane, it was something else. It was the first draft of a universe. The film was called The Life of Larry. It was completed in 1995, and it was 11 minutes long. The story followed a middle-aged, overweight, not particularly bright man named Larry Cummings, who lived with his patient wife Lois, his heavy-set teenage son Milt, and his sardonic, intellectually superior talking dog named Steve. If any of those names or descriptions sound familiar to you, that's not an accident. Larry Cummings was the prototype for Peter Griffin. His wife Lois shared her name with the woman who would become Lois Griffin. His son Milt carried a basic design resemblance to Chris Griffin. And Steve, the intelligent, witty, somewhat world-weary talking dog, was the blueprint for Brian Griffin. The film was rough in the way that student films always are. It had a loose, improvised energy, live-action wraparound segments shot at MacFarlane's family home in Kent, Connecticut, and a very clear-eyed understanding of a specific type of joke, the joke that comes from placing something extremely sophisticated inside something extremely mundane. Steve, the dog, talks like a sophisticated adult, analyzes situations with dry intelligence, and lives with a man who barely seems capable of feeding himself. The gap between them is the comedy. Now, here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. MacFarlane's professor at RISD was so impressed with The Life of Larry that he submitted it to Hanna-Barbera, one of the most storied animation studios in the history of American television. Hanna-Barbera is the company that gave the world the Flintstones, Yogi Bear, Scooby-Doo, and 100 other characters that became permanently embedded in the cultural consciousness of multiple generations. It wasn't exactly a company you'd expect to be scouting student films from Rhode Island art schools, but they were, apparently, and MacFarlane's thesis caught their attention. He was hired in 1995, fresh out of college, before most of his peers had figured out what they wanted to eat for breakfast. At Hanna-Barbera, which was transitioning into Cartoon Network Studios during this period, MacFarlane worked on shows like Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, and Cow and Chicken. He was in his early 20s, working as a writer and animator in Hollywood, gaining experience while the ideas for something bigger continued to develop in the back of his mind. By 1996, he had made a sequel to The Life of Larry. He called it Larry and Steve. This short film starred the same middle-aged man and his talking dog, and it aired on Cartoon Network as part of their World Premiere Toons programming block, a showcase for short animated pieces from new talent. When it aired, somebody from Fox was watching. Fox Broadcasting Company came calling. They'd seen both the Larry shorts and they recognized something in them. A voice, an energy, a sensibility that felt fresh. They asked MacFarlane to develop a series based on those characters. He was given a budget of $50,000 and asked to produce a 15-minute pilot. MacFarlane has said in interviews that the pilot took him about 6 months to complete, and that he did much of the work himself at home. He was 24 years old when he pitched it to Fox in May of 1998. The executives at Fox who reviewed the pitch, Gary Newman and Dana Walden, were convinced enough to commission 13 episodes. MacFarlane was signed to a $2.5 million per year production deal. He was 24 years old. The deal made him, at the time, the youngest person ever to be given their own network television show. That fact alone is worth sitting with for a moment. 24 years old. Most people that age are still figuring out how to do their laundry consistently. The show that MacFarlane built from that pilot was Family Guy. It would be set in a fictional Rhode Island town. It would follow the Griffin family, Peter and Lois, their 3 children, Meg, Chris, and baby Stewie, and their talking dog, Brian. The influence of The Life of Larry was unmistakable. Peter was Larry, rebuilt and refined. Brian was Steve, elevated and deepened. The bones of what MacFarlane had first imagined in a college thesis film were still clearly visible beneath the skin of the finished show. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999 in one of the single best television time slots that money could not buy. It aired right after Super Bowl 33. That particular game was between the Denver Broncos and the Atlanta Falcons, and it drew an audience of roughly 83 million people, the kind of captive, lounging, not going anywhere audience that every television executive on the planet dreams about. When the Super Bowl ended and Family Guy began, approximately 22 million of those people stayed where they were and watched the first episode. 22 million people. For context, that's more than the entire population of the state of Florida at the time, watching a cartoon about a fat man in Rhode Island and his weirdly eloquent baby. The first episode was called Death Has a Shadow. It introduced all of the characters, established the show's tone, and demonstrated the cutaway gag format that would become the most widely recognized stylistic feature of the series. In that episode, Peter loses his job at the Happy-Go-Lucky toy factory after falling asleep during a safety training video. He files for unemployment but accidentally checks a box that gets him a much higher amount than he was entitled to, leading to him receiving a check for $100,000. The story is simple, almost deliberately uncomplicated, but it gave the writers room to stuff the episode with those signature quick-cut gags and to introduce the characters in ways that felt natural rather than expository. The voice cast was in place from that very first episode. Seth MacFarlane himself provided the voices for Peter, Brian, and Stewie, 3 distinct, memorable voices that came from 3 very different sources. Peter's voice was inspired by a real person. While MacFarlane was a student at RISD, there was a security guard who worked on campus named Paul Timmons. Timmons had a thick Rhode Island accent, a loud, unfiltered delivery, and the kind of total absence of social self-editing that MacFarlane found endlessly fascinating. He based Peter's voice directly on that man. In 2013, a local news station in New England actually tracked Paul Timmons down and interviewed him, and Timmons confirmed the connection. He said, with evident pride, "I'm very proud of it. I am clearly the visual of Peter because the character of Peter is an idiot." Stewie's voice came from a completely different place. MacFarlane has said that he based Stewie on Rex Harrison, specifically on Harrison's performance as Henry Higgins in the 1964 musical My Fair Lady. Harrison played Higgins with a particular brand of clipped, aristocratic irritability, a man who spoke as though the world consistently failed to meet his very reasonable standards. That quality-cultured, impatient, slightly contemptuous, translated perfectly into the voice of a baby who believed himself to be the most sophisticated person in every room. MacFarlane has also mentioned, on more than one occasion, that there's a shade of Mr. Burns from The Simpsons in Stewie's darker register. The description MacFarlane himself has used is an evil Rex Harrison, which is honestly one of the most precisely accurate character descriptions ever committed to words. Brian's voice, by contrast, came from the simplest possible source. It's MacFarlane's natural speaking voice. Not a character voice, not an impression, not a performance, just Seth MacFarlane talking the way Seth MacFarlane talks. There's something interesting about that choice. Brian is in many ways the character most closely based on MacFarlane himself, a failed writer with literary pretensions, liberal politics, a complicated relationship with alcohol, and a habit of falling for entirely the wrong people. The choice to use his own voice for Brian wasn't accidental. It was an acknowledgement, made from the very beginning, of how closely the two of them were connected. Lois was voiced by Alex Borstein, who based the character's accent on a cousin of hers from Great Neck, New York, that particular stretched, nasal Long Island delivery that's immediately recognizable to anyone who's spent time in the northeastern United States. Borstein has been with the show since that first episode and has become one of the most acclaimed voice actresses in animation history, winning multiple Emmy Awards for her work on other projects while continuing to voice Lois through dozens of seasons. Meg was originally voiced by Lacey Chabert in Season 1. Starting from Season 2, Mila Kunis took over the role and has been the voice of Meg ever since. Kunis was barely 18 when she started on the show, which is a strange thing to consider given how long she's now held the role. Seth Green voiced Chris from the start, and the origin story of Chris's voice is one of the more delightful behind-the-scenes facts about the entire show. When Green went to audition for the role, a friend of his dared him to do his best impression of Buffalo Bill, the serial killer villain from The Silence of the Lambs, specifically Jonathan Demme's 1991 film. Green, apparently being the kind of person who accepts these dares, did exactly that in the audition room. The producers hired him on the basis of that voice. Chris Griffin's voice, the awkward, slightly soft, occasionally alarming delivery of a teenager who is not quite tracking the situation, came directly from one of cinema's most disturbing antagonists, and nobody in the room blinked. The writing team that MacFarlane assembled for those early seasons was a genuinely talented group. Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker all contributed to shaping what the show would become. One of the supporting characters, Neil Goldman, the nerdy classmate who pines after Meg, was named directly after writer Neil Goldman as a kind of in-joke that became permanent. The show's DNA was being formed in those writing rooms, and the people in those rooms were crafting something that had a specific, recognizable voice. The show went on to air its first regular season beginning in April 1999, initially placed in an excellent Sunday night time slot after The Simpsons and before The X-Files. For a new animated comedy, this was a privileged position, and for a while it worked. The first season averaged around 12.8 million households, landing the show at number 33 inches the overall Nielsen ratings for that year. Not a dominant performer, but solid for a brand new show trying to carve out a space next to one of the most beloved animated series ever made. A detail about the show's very first episode worth noting: the original broadcast of Death Has a Shadow was cut from the home video and streaming versions in a specific way. In the episode's original airing, there was a brief scene that has been edited out of subsequent versions. The first episode that most people who encounter the show on streaming or DVD are watching is not exactly identical to what aired that January night in 1999. These small differences between broadcast and home versions exist across multiple early episodes, and tracking them requires the specific attention of someone who has watched both versions. The show's creator was 25 years old at the time of the show's premiere, younger even than the 24 at which he'd pitched it, given that a year of production had passed between the deal and the broadcast. 25. The person who gave voice to Peter, to Stewie, to Brian, who had built these characters from a thesis film, who had pitched them to a network and convinced that network to give him a primetime slot, was 25 years old when his show aired to 22 million people following the Super Bowl. The specific improbability of this sequence of events is not diminished by how frequently it's referenced in discussions of the show's history. The $50,000 budget given to MacFarlane to produce the original 15-minute pilot is another figure worth contemplating. $50,000. The amount of professional animation that can be produced for $50,000 in the mid-1990s is not very much. MacFarlane has said that he worked on the pilot largely alone, doing much of the production himself at home, stretching the budget across every element of the production. The finished pilot was rough, in ways that the network understood were the result of the budget rather than the ambition, and they funded the full production of 13 episodes on the strength of what they saw in those 15 rough minutes. Fox, for all the scheduling chaos that would eventually doom the show's original run, gave it an unusually generous launch. The Sunday night slot after The Simpsons was about as good a launching position as a new animated comedy could hope for in 1999. The network's promotional investment in the show's premiere, placing it after the Super Bowl, generating advance press about the young creator, reflected genuine enthusiasm for what they had acquired. The subsequent scheduling chaos was not malice, but rather the specific institutional indifference of a large network to an individual show once the initial enthusiasm of acquisition passes. The show was moved because other shows needed the good slots, and the people making those decisions probably didn't think very carefully about the cumulative effect on an audience that was trying to find the show week after week in different places. What MacFarlane accomplished in building the show from scratch in those 6 months of pilot production, creating the characters, writing the dialogue, establishing the voice, designing the visual world, finding the specific tone that made it different from everything around it, represents a creative achievement that the show's later commercial success tends to obscure. It's easy to look back at Family Guy and see it as the inevitable success it became. It was not inevitable. It was the result of a very specific talent at a very specific moment, making a series of very specific choices that happened to connect with an audience that was ready for exactly that specific thing. But Fox, as Fox tends to do, began making decisions that would complicate things. They started moving the show around. Different nights, different time slots, seemingly without any consistent strategy. Thursday night against Frasier on NBC. Tuesday night against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. The audience had trouble keeping up with where the show had gone. Ratings dipped. By the end of season 3 in 2002, Fox pulled the plug. Family Guy was canceled for the first time. It looked, to most people, like that was the end of the story. It was not in any way the end of the story. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing all the different places people tune in from. And if you're enjoying this, make sure you're subscribed. It genuinely helps more than you know. Section 2. The Griffin Family Hidden Depths and Strange Details. There's a version of Family Guy where the Griffin family is just a sketch. A fat dad, a patient mom, the unpopular teenager, the dim son, the evil baby, the talking dog. That version of the family exists in the show's weaker later episodes, where the characters have been flattened down to their most basic functions. But in the beginning, and in the best moments scattered across the show's long run, there's something more textured going on. The characters were built with layers that most casual viewers never fully appreciated, and the details embedded in their design, their backstory, and their specific behavioral quirks are worth examining closely. Let's start with Peter Griffin himself, because Peter is the axis around which everything else rotates. The physical design of Peter went through a process of refinement before landing on the version we know. His body shape extremely round, with almost no neck visible between his round head and his round belly, was a deliberate design choice. The show's original animation director made a decision early on to give Peter proportions that read instantly from a distance, the kind of silhouette you could identify in a single frame. That oversized body and those tiny, constantly surprised eyes became one of the most recognizable character designs in animation history. The glasses Peter wears were part of the character from the very beginning, giving him a slightly academic, professorial look that sits in stark, ironic contrast to his total absence of intellectual engagement with the world around him. Peter's full name is Justin Peter Griffin, which is something the show revealed much later in its run. But there's a detail about his background that was established very early and is easy to overlook. Peter was raised as an Irish Catholic in Quahog, Rhode Island, and his relationship with the church and with faith is one of the threads that appears and disappears throughout the show's history. His mother, Thelma Griffin, was a strong presence in his life, and his complex relationship with his father, who turned out to be his stepfather, Francis, rather than his biological father, added genuine emotional texture to a character who is often reduced to his most cartoonish traits by people who only know the later seasons. The voice behind Peter, as we discussed, came from a real person, a security guard at RISD named Paul Timmons. But there's an additional dimension to that inspiration that's worth knowing. MacFarlane has spoken about how Timmons represented something specific to him, a man who said exactly what he thought, at full volume, with zero social filtering, without any apparent awareness that this might be unusual or inappropriate. That's a very precise behavioral description, and it maps almost perfectly onto how Peter functioned in the early seasons. He wasn't mean, he wasn't cruel. He was simply operating without the internal governor that most adults develop somewhere around adolescence. The comedy came from that gap between his good intentions and the social chaos his complete lack of self-awareness produced. Lois Griffin's background is one of the more interesting character histories in the show. Her maiden name is Pewterschmidt, which tells you everything you need to know about her family before you even meet them. The Pewterschmidts are wealthy old money, the kind of inherited wealth that comes with its own vocabulary, its own set of unspoken rules, and a certain baseline contempt for the kind of life their daughter chose. Lois's father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is a recurring presence in the show, and his relationship with Peter, this barely concealed horror that his daughter married this particular man, is a reliable source of genuine comedy in the early seasons. The fact that Lois came from this background and chose Peter deliberately, chose a working-class toy factory employee who drinks Pawtucket Patriot Ale at a bar called the Drunken Clam, says something interesting about her as a character. She's not with Peter because it's all she could get. She's with Peter because she genuinely loves him, and that love is one of the things the early show protected carefully. Alex Borstein, as noted, based Lois's voice on a cousin from Great Neck, New York. But there's a layer to the performance that Borstein has discussed in interviews. She deliberately plays Lois with a warmth that keeps the character from becoming a simple straight man foil. Lois is the one who loves and enables Peter in equal measure, who is capable of genuine wisdom and genuine weakness within the same episode, and who has her own complicated interior life that the show occasionally excavates before carefully filling back in. In the early seasons, Lois is the show's emotional center in ways that rarely get credited. Meg Griffin's character history deserves its own extended examination, and we'll return to it at length in a later section. But for now, consider this detail about her design. The hat Meg always wears, that tight pink knit cap, was a design choice made specifically to give her a visual identity that would be instantly recognizable even in the background of a scene. The writers knew early on that Meg was going to be the family member who existed at the edge of scenes, in the margins, frequently ignored by everyone around her. The hat was a way of making her visible even in her invisibility. Every time you see that pink hat in the background of a scene where nobody is talking to Meg, it's doing exactly the work it was designed to do. Meg's first voice actress was Lacey Chabert, who was between seasons of Party of Five when she took the role. Chabert only stayed for one season before departing, and Mila Kunis stepped in for season 2. The transition between the two performers is interesting because the character sounds subtly different. Chabert's Meg had a slightly warmer, slightly less resigned quality, while Kunis brought something a little flatter and more defeated to the voice, which ended up suiting the direction the character would take. The choice to have Mila Kunis provide Meg's singing voice through a different actress, Tara Strong, who has voiced more animated characters than almost anyone in the history of the medium, was made because the singing voice needed specific qualities that went beyond what Kunis was hired to deliver. Chris Griffin is, in many ways, the most underwritten major character on the show, and there's a reason for that which goes back to the character's origins in The Life of Larry. Milt, the teenage son in McFarlane's thesis film, was designed as a background character present enough to be part of the family tableau, developed just enough to participate in occasional jokes. Chris inherited that position in Family Guy. Seth Green voices him with that Buffalo Bill inspiration, which gives Chris an oddly unplaceable quality. He's not quite stupid, not quite wise, not quite aware, occupying a space in most scenes where he's there but not really affecting anything. His relationship with the evil monkey who lives in his closet, a joke that ran across multiple seasons before being resolved in a later episode, is probably the most sustained thing the show ever did with him, and even that was more of a running sight gag than genuine character work. The evil monkey, incidentally, deserves a brief mention. He showed up in Chris's closet periodically through the early and middle seasons, pointing at Chris with an expression of accusatory menace. The joke was entirely visual, no explanation, no backstory. Just this monkey in the closet pointing. When the show eventually revealed that the evil monkey had been traumatized by his wife leaving him for another monkey, it gave the long-running visual gag an emotional underpinning that nobody expected, and that made the revelation genuinely funny precisely because of how earnestly it was played. Stewie Griffin's physical design is worth examining in detail because it communicates something very specific about the character that goes beyond what he says. His head is shaped like an American football. That choice was entirely deliberate. The unusual head shape makes him visually distinct from every other character in the show and subtly reinforces the idea that there's something not quite right about this baby, something that doesn't conform to normal human proportions. His yellow shirt, his red shorts, and his white shoes are deliberately infantile clothing choices, the visual shorthand for baby, worn by a character whose behavior and speech patterns are anything but infantile. That contrasts the adult vocabulary and the baby clothes is baked into every single scene he appears in. The character of Stewie was, in those first 3 seasons, genuinely dangerous in a way that's hard to fully convey to someone who only knows the later, gentler version of the character. He built functioning laser rifles. He constructed a time machine. He built devices capable of mind control and weather manipulation. He spoke in extended monologues about his plans for world domination while sitting in a high chair eating strained peas. The humor was always about the gap between those two things, the sophistication of the content and the context it was delivered in. And underneath all the weapons and the plans, there was the singular obsession with killing his mother Lois, which Stewie himself once explained in the show was motivated by his resentment at spending 9 months in what he called that ovarian Bastille. Brian Griffin's physical design is a white Labrador retriever. He walks upright on 2 legs, drives a car, writes novels, drinks martinis, and speaks in a measured, dry baritone. The comedy of Brian in those early seasons was never about the fact that he's a dog. That fact was treated as entirely unremarkable by the show. Nobody found it strange that the family dog had opinions about Hemingway. The comedy was that Brian was the most intelligent, most self-aware, most emotionally sophisticated member of a family that also contained a man like Peter. The dog was the adult in the room, and the humans were the children. And that inversion was the engine that drove the Peter and Brian dynamic through the best years of the show. One detail about Brian's character that MacFarlane has confirmed. Brian is largely based on MacFarlane himself, the failed novel that Brian works on for years without finishing. The political views that are genuinely held but occasionally expressed too loudly in the wrong setting. The tendency to fall for women who are emotionally unavailable or simply unsuited to him. The relationship with alcohol that functions somewhere between social lubricant and genuine coping mechanism. These are all aspects of Brian that MacFarlane has acknowledged drawing from his own life and personality. The fact that Brian uses MacFarlane's natural speaking voice, the voice of Seth MacFarlane when he's just talking, without performing, reinforces how personal the character is. One more family member deserves attention here, and that's Stewie's teddy bear, Rupert. Rupert is not a character in any traditional sense. He doesn't speak, he doesn't move, he doesn't do anything a stuffed animal wouldn't do. But his relationship with Stewie is one of the most consistent and emotionally coherent things in the entire show. Stewie treats Rupert with a tenderness that he rarely shows to any actual living being. He talks to Rupert, confides in him, attributes emotions and opinions to him with complete sincerity. There's a famous and devastating scene in a later season where Brian, while drunk, tears Rupert apart out of irritation. The episode treats that moment with the weight of a genuine act of violence. Because in Stewie's world, it is. The fact that this stuffed bear became the object through which the show most consistently showed Stewie's capacity for love says something genuinely interesting about how the character was conceived. The Griffin family home at 31 Spooner Street is another place where hidden details accumulate. The sheet music visible above Lois's piano in the show's opening sequence is not random notation. It's the actual sheet music for the Family Guy theme song. When Lois is shown using Facebook in one episode, there's a visible notification on her profile showing that Meg has sent her a friend request that Lois has not accepted. These tiny, specific, blink and you'll miss them details were planted by writers and animators who knew that someone, somewhere, would pause the frame and look. The show's relationship with its own attentive fans was always reciprocal in ways like this. The canceled show that refused to die. The cancellation of Family Guy in 2002 was, at the time, treated as a routine business decision. The show had been moved around the schedule so many times that its audience had difficulty keeping track of where it had gone. It competed against Frasier one season and Friends the next. Friends, in the 2001 to 2002 television season was the most watched show in the entire country. Being placed directly opposite, it was less a scheduling decision and more of an execution. The ratings dropped sharply, and Fox canceled the show after its third season. 22 episodes had been produced for season 3, but one of them, we'll get to which one in a later section, hadn't aired. Fox tried to sell the rerun rights to the show. In a move that would become one of the most consequential financial decisions in the history of American television, Fox sold those rights to Cartoon Network for what has been described as almost nothing. The reasoning was straightforward. The show had been canceled twice, its ratings had been poor, and nobody at Fox was under the impression that this particular dead property was worth much. Cartoon Network acquired the rights to air Family Guy reruns on their Adult Swim programming block, which occupied the late-night hours on the network. The show was acquired cheaply because it was perceived to have very little remaining value. Adult Swim premiered the Family Guy reruns on the 20th of April 2003. What happened next is one of those genuinely strange television stories that doesn't follow any of the conventional rules about how audiences work. The reruns became the most watched programming on the entire Adult Swim block, almost overnight. Not gradually, not slowly building immediately dominant. The show averaged around 1.9 million viewers for its late-night reruns, which is an extraordinary number for syndicated repeats of a canceled series airing at midnight. Adult Swim's overall viewership increased by 239% in the period following the Family Guy premiere on the network. 239%. That's not a rounding error. That's a transformation. Something about the Adult Swim context suited Family Guy in a way that Fox's primetime lineup never had. The late-night audience for Adult Swim skewed younger, skewed male, and skewed toward exactly the demographic that had been quietly discovering Family Guy on its own terms rather than through whatever Fox's marketing department had decided to say about it. These were college students, night owls, people who weren't watching television the way the Nielsen rating system was designed to measure. They weren't sitting in living rooms with boxes on their televisions. They were in dorm rooms, in apartments, watching with groups of friends, discovering the show as a communal experience. And they were telling other people about it. Simultaneously, Fox released the Season 1 and Season 2 DVD sets. The timing was partly planned, partly lucky, and the result was astonishing. The Season 1 and Season 2 sets sold over 2.2 million copies. They became the best-selling television DVD sets of 2003, not in the animation category, not in the comedy category, the best-selling television DVD sets of that entire year, in any genre. The second best-selling television DVD set of all time up to that point, behind only the first season of Chappelle's Show from Comedy Central. People were not just watching the reruns. They were buying the show. They were putting money on the counter and taking the physical discs home and watching them again. The show that Fox had essentially given away was generating commercial enthusiasm that Fox's own promotional machinery hadn't managed to produce when the show was actually airing. Fox started paying attention. The network that had canceled Family Guy twice began to reconsider. A year after the Adult Swim premiere, in 2004, Fox made the announcement that the show was being revived for a fourth season. New episodes would be produced. The Griffins were coming back. This was, at the time, essentially unprecedented. Shows that get canceled once sometimes come back. Shows that get canceled twice stay canceled. The conventional wisdom of the television industry at the time was that Family Guy's revival simply could not happen because shows like that didn't come back. But Family Guy had built something that the conventional wisdom hadn't accounted for: a genuinely devoted, actively evangelizing fan base that had discovered the show through channels the industry wasn't measuring properly. The revival happened because of DVD sales and late-night cable reruns. It happened because of word of mouth in an era just before social media existed to amplify word of mouth. It happened because a generation of young viewers found a show they connected with and told their friends about it, one conversation at a time. Family Guy is historically significant for this reason specifically. It is widely credited as the first television series to be brought back from cancellation primarily because of DVD sales and rerun ratings rather than network lobbying or critical pressure. The mechanism that saved it fans spending their own money on physical media to demonstrate their affinity for the show created a template that the television industry has referenced ever since. Every time a canceled show generates petition campaigns and home video sales and social media campaigns arguing for its revival, the model for why any of that might work traces back to what Family Guy's audience did between 2002 and 2004. There's a detail about the production timeline of the revival that most fans don't know. According to the show's own 20th anniversary art book, the writer's room began working on Season 5, yes, Season 5, roughly 6 months before Fox officially announced the revival of the show. The production company, 20th Television, made a decision that the show would be made regardless of what Fox decided. If Fox had passed on reviving it, the episodes would have gone to Adult Swim instead. The confidence in the show's commercial viability was high enough that new episodes were being written and developed before the network commitment was officially in place. This is a significant detail because it tells you how differently the show was being perceived inside the industry by 2004 compared to how it had been perceived in 2002. 2 years earlier, it was a liability being sold for almost nothing. Now it was valuable enough that a production company was preemptively making episodes before a network deal was signed. Season 4 premiered on the 1st of May, 2005, drawing 11.85 million viewers for its first episode back. Fox put it in the middle of their Sunday night animation domination lineup, alongside The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and a brand new Seth MacFarlane creation called American Dad. The return was a cultural event. People who had watched the show through its original run and people who had discovered it on Adult Swim and people who had heard about it from their friends but never seen it all showed up at the same time. The excitement around the revival was genuine, sustained, and commercially significant. But here's the part of the revival story that gets overlooked in the straightforward narrative of fan triumph. The show that came back in 2005 was not quite the same show that had been canceled in 2002. The writing staff had been scattered across 3 years of other work. The tone had begun to shift in subtle ways that wouldn't become fully visible until several seasons later. The characters had started the process of change that would, over the years, alter them significantly from what they had been in those first 3 seasons. The success of the revival was real. What it preserved and what it didn't is a more complicated story. One of the stranger facts about the cancellation period is what happened to the episode that hadn't aired. When the show was canceled after Season 3, one episode was left unbroadcast. That episode was called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and Fox had been sitting on it since it was produced in 2003 full seasons before the cancellation happened. Fox had kept the episode off the air over concerns that it might be perceived as anti-Semitic. The episode follows Peter seeking financial advice from a Jewish lawyer because he holds the stereotypical belief that Jewish people are inherently better with money. The episode is, in fact, a satire of that exact belief, skewering Peter's ignorance rather than endorsing it. But Fox's censors were worried about how it would land, and so the episode sat in a drawer. During the Adult Swim rerun period, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein finally aired uncut, on a network that was less squeamish about such things. Fox eventually aired it themselves in 2004, 4 years after it was produced. The episode's delayed release became, ironically, part of its mythology, the rare Family Guy episode that viewers knew about before they'd seen it. There's also the detail about the unaired episode that arrived with the DVD sets, appearing there before it ever hit television. The show's dedicated fans knew its existence from the DVDs before it was broadcast. This inverted the normal media relationship. Typically, you watch something on television and then buy the DVD. Family Guy, during this period, was a show you bought on DVD to see episodes that hadn't been on television. It was ahead of the streaming era in the most literal possible sense, delivering exclusive content to paying customers before the broadcast version caught up. The Adult Swim deal also came with something that many fans of the original broadcast didn't know about. When Adult Swim aired the episodes, they sometimes aired versions with scenes and dialogue that had been cut from the original Fox broadcasts. Fox, as a broadcast network, operated under stricter content standards than Cartoon Network's adult block. The Adult Swim versions of certain early episodes contained material that Fox had edited out moments that gave scenes extra shading or pushed jokes further than the broadcast version had been willing to go. Fans who watched on Adult Swim were sometimes seeing slightly different versions of episodes they thought they already knew. The show existed during this period in multiple versions simultaneously, which is another way in which it anticipated the fragmented, multi-platform media landscape that would become normal a decade later. The full story of the cancellation and revival of Family Guy is worth knowing, not just as an interesting footnote in the show's history, but as a demonstration of something larger about how audiences and commercial media relate to each other. The show survived because its audience refused to let it die, and they refused to let it die using the mechanisms available to them at that specific historical moment. DVD sales, cable reruns, word of mouth. 3 years later, the streaming era would change all of those mechanisms beyond recognition. But in 2003 and 2004, this was how audiences spoke the loudest. And Family Guy heard them. Section 4. One Man, Four Voices. The remarkable vocal reality of Seth MacFarlane. There are very few people in the history of American entertainment who can honestly say that they are the creative and vocal center of a major network television show. Seth MacFarlane is one of them, and the specifics of what he does on every single episode of Family Guy represent a level of vocal and creative demand that is genuinely unusual. When you watch an episode of Family Guy, Seth MacFarlane is the voice you hear most often. Not because of screen time necessarily, though Peter and Brian and Stewie all appear in virtually every episode. It's because MacFarlane voices all three of those major characters, plus Quagmire, plus Tom Tucker, the news anchor, plus Carter Pewterschmidt, plus an enormous catalog of one-time or recurring minor characters that accumulates across every season of the show. Estimates vary about exactly how many characters he voices across the run of the series, but the number is somewhere north of 40. 40 distinct characters, each with a recognizable voice, each requiring consistency across multiple seasons of production. The way the recording process works for Family Guy is different from what most people assume. The voice actors don't sit together in a room and perform scenes with each other the way actors on a live-action show do. They record separately. Each actor comes in, sits in a booth, and records their lines from the script, usually alone or with a director. The performances are then edited together in post-production. This means that Seth MacFarlane, in a single recording session, might record scenes as Peter, then as Stewie, then as Brian, then as Quagmire, potentially switching between 4 distinct vocal personalities multiple times within the same hour. The mental flexibility required to do this consistently, across hundreds of episodes, without bleeding any of the characters into each other, is a real technical skill that doesn't get enough credit. The difference between Peter's voice and Brian's voice illustrates this range precisely. Peter's voice is loud, somewhat nasal, delivers every line as though volume is a substitute for clarity, and carries that thick New England working-class accent. Brian's voice, MacFarlane's natural voice, is measured, slightly wry, operates at a lower register, and sounds like a man who is choosing his words carefully even when he's drunk. Moving between those two modes repeatedly in the same session, recording Peter's reaction followed immediately by Brian's reaction to the same event, is the kind of thing that looks effortless on screen precisely because it isn't. Stewie presents a third completely different challenge. The Rex Harrison impression that MacFarlane developed for the character requires a specific kind of clipped, aristocratic delivery that has its own rhythms and its own internal logic. The words have to land in a particular way to sound like Stewie rather than like a generic British accent. MacFarlane won a Primetime Emmy Award in the year 2000, the show's second year of existence, for outstanding voiceover performance for the character of Stewie. He was 26 years old. The award is a piece of information worth sitting with. In just its second season, while Seth Green was basing Chris's voice on a serial killer and Alex Borstein was perfecting her Long Island cousin impression, the show's creator was already being recognized by the Television Academy for the vocal performance he was giving to a baby villain. Glenn Quagmire is a fourth distinct character that MacFarlane voices. Quagmire's voice is something MacFarlane has described as drawing from old Dean Martin-style lounge singers, that specific brand of mid-century masculine confidence that operated on the assumption that charm was both a weapon and an identity. The character was designed as a satire of a certain type of person, an extreme version of the retro playboy archetype, and the voice had to carry that specific historical flavor. Quagmire's catchphrase "giggity" became one of the most recognized things in the show's vocabulary, which says something about how effectively a few syllables can summarize a character when they're delivered with the right specific energy. The fact that MacFarlane voiced both Peter and Quagmire, two characters who interact regularly, and that the two voices are distinct enough that viewers never confuse them, is a piece of craft that deserves acknowledgement. In early episodes, when Peter and Quagmire are having a conversation at the Drunken Clam, MacFarlane is effectively having a conversation with himself, recording both sides of the exchange on separate occasions. The comedy of the dynamic between those two characters comes partially from the gap between their voices, Peter's blustering, Quagmire's smoother, and both sides of that gap come from the same throat. Alex Borstein's history with Lois is one of those origin stories that contains its own unexpected detail. Borstein was a cast member on Mad TV when Seth MacFarlane was working at Fox, and he heard her doing her cousin's Long Island accent during a sketch rehearsal. That specific voice, that particular regional accent, the vowels stretched in just that way, the cadence of Long Island Jewish American speech applied to the specific rhythms of a cartoon character was what MacFarlane wanted for Lois. He asked Borstein to come in and record the character, and the voice she used in that first recording was essentially the voice of her actual cousin from Great Neck. That cousin's specific way of talking has now been heard by hundreds of millions of people across more than 2 decades, which is a genuinely strange thought if you sit with it. Seth Green, who voices Chris, is also the co-creator and star of Robot Chicken, an animated sketch comedy show on Adult Swim. This dual identity has created a persistent and extremely specific type of inside joke in Family Guy that the show has maintained across multiple seasons. Whenever Family Guy makes a joke at the expense of Robot Chicken, and it has done this repeatedly with varying degrees of gentleness, Chris Griffin is conspicuously absent from those jokes or reacts differently to them than the other characters because his voice actor is the creator of the target. This is a running comedic acknowledgement of Seth Green's dual role that requires you to know both shows to appreciate it. The show trusts that some portion of its audience will understand this specific meta-joke and rewards those viewers accordingly. Mila Kunis, as mentioned, came to the role of Meg when she was barely 18. She had already been working as an actress on That 70s Show, which was also on Fox, and she was hired partly through the convenience of the existing relationship between the actress and the network. Her mother, reportedly, was not entirely pleased about the kind of material Meg was required to say and respond to, particularly as the show's humor pushed into darker territory. Kunis has spoken publicly about how people would approach her at events and repeat Peter's dismissive line toward Meg, the one that became a kind of cultural shorthand for how the character was treated, directed at the actual woman who gave Meg her voice. The fictional cruelty seeped out of the screen and found real-world expression in a way that Kunis has described as unsettling. The guest voice history of Family Guy is its own remarkable catalog. Patrick Stewart, best known as Captain Picard from Star Trek. The Next Generation voiced a character named Consuela, the cleaning lady, in an early episode before going on to appear in several other capacities across the run of the show. The contrast between Stewart's extraordinary classical theatrical training and the material he was delivering in this context was part of the joke, though Stewart himself has said he found the show genuinely funny. Betty White appeared in the show. Ellen Page appeared. Ryan Reynolds, John Goodman, David Bowie, Carrie Fisher. The guest roster is a reflection of the show's cultural position in its prime years, the place where celebrities went to show they were in on the joke, to demonstrate a willingness to let the show mock their public image, to participate in something that had the cultural energy of the moment. One of the stranger guest voice facts involves the character of Death, the Grim Reaper, who appeared in several early episodes. Adam Carolla, the comedian and radio personality, voiced Death in those appearances. The character was originally conceived as a recurring presence in every episode, not as a major character, but as a kind of omnipresent figure in the margins of the show's world. That concept was scaled back very early in production, but Death remained in specific episodes where the plot required a supernatural element. The character of Francis Griffin, Peter's stepfather, was voiced by Charles Durning for most of his appearances. Durning was a genuine Hollywood veteran, an actor who had been working in major films since the 1970s, and the casting of someone with Durning's specific gravitas in the role of Peter's disapproving Catholic stepfather gave the character a weight that contributed to the emotional texture of the Peter family history storylines. The contrast between Durning's rich, authoritative voice and the comedy around it was one of those casting choices that worked more precisely than it needed to. Jennifer Tilly, who voices Bonnie Swanson, brings a very specific quality to the character that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Tilly is an Academy Award-nominated actress whose film work includes Bullets Over Broadway, Bound, and the Chucky franchise. The specific breathy, high-register quality of her voice was used in Family Guy to give Bonnie a perpetually uncertain, slightly suspended quality, as though she's always just about to say something important that she hasn't quite decided to say. Across the character's many seasons of existence, mostly as a background presence at neighborhood gatherings and drunken clam nights, that vocal quality accumulated into something that's hard to describe precisely but immediately recognizable once you notice it. The show's recording process, while described broadly as individual booth sessions, had specific practices that varied across different periods of production. In the earlier seasons, there were occasional table reads where the cast assembled together to work through scripts before individual recording sessions. These table reads served both a creative function, giving the writers and producers a chance to hear the script before committing to individual recording, and a social function, maintaining the relationships between cast members who otherwise interacted primarily through their characters' relationships on screen. As the show matured, and the cast's other professional commitments grew, the practicalities of scheduling made these assemblies less frequent. The sheer volume of content that Seth MacFarlane has recorded across the show's run represents a staggering individual contribution. If Family Guy produces an average of 15 episodes per season and has now completed 25-plus seasons, and each episode features MacFarlane voicing at minimum 4 major characters across multiple scenes, the hours of recorded performance that exist in the show's archives from MacFarlane alone would constitute a substantial body of work by any measure. The consistency required maintaining the same vocal characters across episodes recorded months apart, sometimes years apart, is a craft discipline that MacFarlane has maintained across a longer run than virtually any other voice actor in the history of American animation. MacFarlane has discussed in interviews what it's like to spend a recording session switching between characters. He describes a specific mental process of shifting registers, lowering himself into Peter's working-class bluster, pulling up into Stewie's clipped aristocratic disdain, settling into Brian's measured naturalism. The transitions are not effortless, but they have become, across 25 years of practice, something that he can execute with considerable speed. The session recordings that producers and directors have occasionally described publicly suggest that MacFarlane typically records quickly, without excessive takes, moving through the script with the efficiency that comes from thorough familiarity with the characters. The voices have become, at this point in his career, as natural to him as his own speaking voice, which, after all, is Brian's voice, and has been for longer than most people spend on any single professional endeavor. The recording process for the show has an interesting quirk that voice actors have mentioned in various interviews over the years. Because the actors record separately, they are often reacting to dialogue they haven't heard the other actors deliver. The script tells them what the other character said, and they record their reaction, but the actual performance that their character is responding to doesn't exist yet when they're in the booth. This means that every conversation in Family Guy is, at some level, a conversation between performances that were created independently and then assembled into something that sounds like genuine exchange. The editors and directors who make those assembled pieces sound like natural conversation are doing a significant amount of invisible work that the finished product makes easy to take for granted. Section 5. Easter eggs, hidden jokes, and the deep background. Family Guy has always rewarded obsessive attention in a way that not every television show does. This is partly by design. The writers have consistently embedded jokes in backgrounds, in newspaper headlines, in incidental details that would only be visible to someone pausing the frame or watching very closely. It's also partly a consequence of the animation process, which involves large numbers of people at multiple stages working on the visual content of each episode. When many people contribute to what a scene looks like, things get added that the official record sometimes doesn't account for. Let's start with one of the cleanest examples. In a Season 4 episode called Model Misbehavior, there's a brief shot of a newspaper headline. The main headline is about something happening with the Griffin family. The smaller headline below it, visible only for a moment and clearly designed for people watching on DVD or pausing the frame, reads, "DVDs paused for headline joke, millions disappointed." The show was acknowledging, in real time, The practice of its own fans hunting for exactly this kind of hidden detail, while simultaneously providing a hidden detail for those fans to find. It's a loop of self-awareness that required someone to decide, while writing background newspaper text, to include a joke about the people who read background newspaper text. That's a very specific kind of love for an audience. In the show's opening sequence, the credit scene where Lois plays piano and the family gathers around the sheet music visible on the piano rack above Lois's hands is not random notation. It's the actual sheet music for the Family Guy theme song. This detail was confirmed by people who play piano and could actually read it. Someone in the show's art department decided that the sheet music in the background of the credit sequence should be the real sheet music for the song we're hearing in that same moment, and then made it happen, knowing full well that it might never be noticed by the vast majority of viewers. There's a running background appearance that rewards fans who pay attention to the edges of scenes. A character referred to by fans and some show staff as Holden Caulfield, named after the protagonist of The Catcher in the Rye, appeared sporadically across multiple seasons as an unnamed man who would confront Peter for being a big fat phony and then continue to exist in the background of scenes, glaring. For the rest of those episodes, the character doesn't have an official name or role. He's just there, in the margins, embodying the accusation. The show has a habit of hiding references to the actual people who work on it in unexpected places. Several background characters visible in crowd scenes across the show's run are recognizable caricatures of writers, directors, or animators on the production. These are the kind of Easter eggs that are invisible to general audiences but function as in-jokes within the production community, the animated equivalent of a director putting their own face in the background of a movie. In the episode Brian Does Hollywood, Brian travels to Los Angeles to try to break into screenwriting and ends up directing adult films. Near the end of the episode, there's a scene at an awards ceremony for adult films where Ron Jeremy, the famous adult film performer, is presenting an award for Best Original Score. The nominees include Ron Jones and Walter Murphy, both of whom are actual Family Guy composers, and John Williams, the composer responsible for the scores of films like Star Wars, Jurassic Park, and the Indiana Jones series. The joke is that the man who scored some of the most beloved films in the history of cinema is in the running for the best score at an adult film awards ceremony. The specific absurdity of placing John Williams in that context required someone to stop and think about exactly which legitimate composer's name would produce the funniest cognitive dissonance in that context. The Wilhelm scream, a specific sound effect that has appeared in hundreds of films and television shows since the 1950s, shows up multiple times in Family Guy across different episodes. The Wilhelm scream is a kind of inside joke shared across the film and television industry, a specific recorded scream that sound designers insert into productions as a tribute to the tradition of its use. Finding it in Family Guy requires having a good enough ear to recognize it and knowing what you're listening for. There's a detail about the show's universe that becomes visible when you watch carefully across multiple seasons. The town the Griffins live in exists in a consistent geography, or rather, it's supposed to, though the specific layout of Spooner Street, the Drunken Clam, the Giant Chicken's restaurant, and the various other recurring locations shifts and changes in ways that contradict each other. This isn't an Easter egg exactly, but it's a detail that attentive long-term viewers notice and that the show has occasionally acknowledged. The universe of Family Guy is slightly elastic in its spatial logic, which tracks with the show's relationship to continuity more broadly. The Giant Chicken deserves its own extended moment here. The character technically named Ernie the Giant Chicken, with his name revealed by his wife Nicole during a later season restaurant scene, has been the subject of several elaborate multi-minute fight sequences with Peter across the show's run, beginning in the Season 2 episode Da Boom. The fight sequences escalate into extraordinary set pieces of sustained cartoon violence, taking Peter and the chicken through locations ranging from a burning office building to an aircraft carrier to the edge of outer space. The joke is their sheer commitment to the bit, the complete disproportion between the triggering incident, the chicken once gave Peter an expired coupon, and the catastrophic property damage that follows. What the show did with that origin across its run is extraordinary. The fight sequences function as standalone action filmmaking set pieces dropped into the middle of a domestic comedy. Each successive fight takes the combatants through more ambitious sequences, more varied locations, more elaborate setups. One fight involves them being fired into space. One involves an aircraft carrier, a train station, and an airport in sequence. One takes place during a time travel sequence and is played entirely backward. The show's animators clearly relished the opportunity to do something genuinely different in these sequences to produce action animation that the show's weekly format didn't usually allow for, to choreograph extended physical comedy with the care a feature film action sequence would receive. The chicken's apparent immortality is one of the show's running background facts. He has been shot, stabbed, had his head caught in machinery, fallen from great heights, and been left in conditions that would be fatal to any realistic creature. He always recovers. At the end of each fight, after Peter has apparently finished him, the scene holds just long enough after Peter leaves to show the chicken moving, an eye opening, a hand forming a fist. The show established very early that this feud will never end through conventional defeat. These fight sequences have their own internal mythology, their own recurring beats, and they've been analyzed by fans with the kind of attention that serious critics give to extended action filmmaking. The show has hidden specific visual callbacks within these sequences, frames from earlier fights that appear briefly in later ones that you'd only catch if you were watching the chicken battles specifically to spot them. The specific music that plays when Peter and the chicken spot each other has become one of the most recognizable pieces of audio associated with the show, heard in fan-made videos, in memes, in remixes, in contexts entirely removed from Family Guy itself. In the Facebook scene mentioned in an earlier section, the notification showing that Meg has sent her mother a friend request that Lois hasn't accepted is confirmed by multiple fans who paused the episode and read the screen. It's a 4-second window into the Griffin family dynamic that says more about Lois and Meg's relationship than many scenes of actual dialogue do. The casual cruelty of a mother ignoring a friend request from her own daughter, rendered as a background detail in a 2-second shot, is a kind of compressed character writing that the show was capable of at its best. In the show's universe, Jesus Christ appears as a character on a recurring basis, and these appearances always carry specific details. In one episode, Jesus drives a car whose license plate reads WWID, What Would I Do? A direct echo of the WWJD, What Would Jesus Do? Cultural phenomenon of the late 1990s and early 2000s. The change from J to I is the whole joke, and it required someone to think specifically about what the license plate on the car of Jesus himself would logically read. The connection between Family Guy and American Dad, the show that runs in the same fictional universe, has been confirmed and reinforced through specific Easter eggs planted across both shows. In the Stewie Kills Lois 2-part episode, the law enforcement agents who respond to the crisis are visually recognizable as Stan Smith and Deputy Director Bullock from American Dad. This appearance establishes a shared universe in a way that functions as confirmation for fans of both shows without requiring any explanation in either. The characters are just there, in the background, doing their jobs, visible to anyone who watches both shows closely enough to recognize them. The show also drew on its own cast's real-world careers for meta-jokes that rewarded fans who followed those careers. Seth Green created and stars in Robot Chicken, a stop-motion sketch comedy show on Adult Swim. Family Guy has made several pointed jokes about Robot Chicken across its run jokes that imply the show is low quality or not worth watching. Each of these jokes is delivered in the presence of other characters, but conspicuously not Chris, because Seth Green plays Chris, and having Chris mock Robot Chicken would be having Seth Green mock Seth Green's other show. When these jokes happen, Chris is either absent from the scene or reacts differently from the others. The show trusts its most attentive viewers to register this. Alex Borstein, who voices Lois, became an Emmy-winning performer during her years on The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, the Amazon comedy drama set in the 1950s New York comedy world. Family Guy has made references to the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel in episodes where Lois is involved in scenes that parallel Borstein's real-world work on that show. Mila Kunis, who voices Meg, starred in the film Bad Moms and its sequel. Family Guy has referenced those films in episodes where Meg is present, creating another layer of meta-awareness about the relationship between the animated characters and the real performers who give them voice. There's an upside-down message written on the wall behind a character in one episode that reads, "If you can read this, your TV is upside down." The message is written upside down on the wall, so you would need your television to be upside down to read it the correct way up. The elaborate impracticality of this joke, the fact that it requires the physical inversion of your television screen to function as intended, is part of the joke. It's a joke about its own inaccessibility. Someone wrote that and drew it into the background of a scene and waited, presumably with considerable patience, for someone to notice. The show has planted references to its own writing staff throughout the show's background imagery and character names. Several characters who appear as background figures at parties, at local events, in the Drunken Clams crowd are modeled on writers, directors, and animators who worked on the show. These are the kind of Easter eggs that are invisible to general audiences but function as in-jokes within the production community. The long-running tradition in animation of hiding the faces of production staff in crowd scenes goes back decades, and Family Guy has maintained it with the specific enthusiasm of a show whose creative staff has always been aware that some percentage of its audience is paying very close attention. The episode Back to the Pilot contains one of the most multi-layered pieces of meta-commentary in the show's history. In the episode, Brian and Stewie travel back to the events of the show's first episode, Death Has a Shadow, using Stewie's time machine. While observing the original episode's events, they notice that the characters stand completely still during cutaway gags frozen in place, waiting with nothing to do until the cutaway ends and the episode resumes. It's a visual acknowledgement of exactly what critics had been pointing out about the show's structure for years, that the characters are stranded while the cutaway plays, that the cutaway takes the story away from them and leaves them in narrative limbo until it returns. The show was aware of the criticism, acknowledged it visually, and treated the acknowledgement itself as comedy. Whether this constitutes genuine self-awareness or simply the acknowledgement of a structural truth that the show had no intention of changing is a question the episode leaves open. Section 6. The real people behind the characters. Every character in Family Guy was built from somewhere specific. The show didn't generate these people from abstract principles of comedy. They came from real places, real voices, real personalities that MacFarlane and his collaborators encountered in the actual world and filtered through the specific lens of the show they were making. We've established that Peter Griffin's voice came from Paul Timmons, the RISD security guard. But there's another dimension to Peter's inspiration that goes beyond the voice. The behavioral pattern of Peter Griffin, the absolute certainty in his own judgment despite complete ignorance, the social volume without social awareness, the genuine warmth underneath the spectacular incompetence reflects something that MacFarlane observed in a specific type of working-class New England personality. It's a portrait drawn with both affection and exaggeration, but the affection is important. The early Peter was funny because he was recognizable, and he was recognizable because he was drawn from something real. Brian Griffin, as established, is substantially based on MacFarlane himself. The failed novel is a real anxiety that MacFarlane has spoken about the creative person who has ambitions that exceed their discipline, who talks about what they're working on more than they actually work on it. The politics are real. The drinking is real enough to be worth noting. The romantic misfortune is real. MacFarlane once described Brian as the version of himself that talks too much about being smart without always backing it up with the work. There's a self-awareness in that description that illuminates why, in the early seasons, Brian felt like the most fully realized character on the show. He was the most directly personal. Stewie's origins are more conceptual than personal. The character emerged from MacFarlane's interest in what babies would actually be thinking if they could think like adults specifically, if they could think like very intelligent, very frustrated adults who were trapped in circumstances they found humiliating. The idea that the condition of infancy is itself fundamentally degrading the dependence, the indignity of needing others for everything, the complete lack of control over your own life fed directly into Stewie's murderous relationship with his mother. She represents everything about his situation that he resents. Lois's voice, as noted, came from Alex Borstein's actual cousin, but the character's personality has a more specific inspiration that Borstein has discussed. The particular combination of warmth and exasperation, of someone who loves her family without any illusions about their limitations, reflects a kind of New England Jewish-American maternal archetype that Borstein drew from people she actually knew. Lois is not her cousin, but she shares something with a specific tradition of women who maintain their families through a combination of unconditional love and absolute pragmatism. Quagmire's character is a satire of a real archetype, the mid-century masculine ideal, as embodied by certain entertainers, the Rat Pack adjacent persona that treated romantic conquest as both sport and identity. The exaggeration of that archetype is so complete that it functions as both tribute and critique simultaneously. The show was always aware that Quagmire's behavior, taken literally rather than satirically, describes a genuinely terrible person. Episodes like the one where Quagmire delivers his speech condemning Brian's hypocrisy work, partly because Quagmire himself is so clearly flawed. The moral complexity of having your least reliable narrator make your most accurate observation is something the show handled more effectively than most people give it credit for. Cleveland Brown, one of Peter's friends from The Drunken Clam, was voiced by Mike Henry from the show's beginning until 2020, when Henry voluntarily stepped down from the role, citing the inappropriateness of a white actor voicing a black character. The role was recast, with Arif Zahir taking over. Cleveland's design and personality were built on a specific kind of gentle, measured, quietly dignified quality that contrasted with the more volatile personalities around him. He was the friend who maintained his composure while everyone else was losing theirs, which is its own kind of character strength. Joe Swanson, the police officer neighbor who uses a wheelchair, was voiced by Patrick Warburton from the character's first appearance. The casting of Warburton, whose voice is one of the most recognizable in voice acting due to his work on shows like The Venture Bros and his recurring live-action roles, gave Joe a specific quality of matter-of-fact toughness that the character required. Joe's wheelchair was incorporated into the show's comedy not as the butt of jokes, but as a physical fact about the character that was treated with the same casual acceptance as any other physical fact. In the early seasons, at least, the show handled Joe's disability with more dignity than it was typically credited with. Meg's design changed between the show's pilot and its first season. The very earliest version of the character had a slightly different look, and the pink knit cap that became her defining visual feature was added during the refinement process before the show aired. The hat came to represent something specific: Meg's persistent visibility despite the show's insistence on her invisibility. She's always there. The hat is always there. You always see it, and the family always looks through it. The character of Herbert the elderly man, the neighbor who makes intensely uncomfortable comments about Chris, was voiced by Mike Henry and appeared from season 3 onward. The character is clearly designed as a satirical exaggeration of a specific kind of threat, but the show's treatment of him is complicated. He's played partly for horror and partly for a kind of absurdist acceptance, and the tension between those two registers is never fully resolved. He's one of several characters in the show's universe who exist in a space where the comedy and the discomfort are never cleanly separated. James Woods, the actual actor. James Woods appeared in Family Guy as a recurring character playing himself. The show's version of James Woods is obsessed with Peter, hunts him across multiple episodes, and ultimately meets an extremely dark end in later seasons. The real James Woods was an active participant in the character's development, voicing his own animated self with considerable enthusiasm. The joke is built on the premise that James Woods, the real one, is exactly unhinged enough that this characterization is plausible. It requires a specific kind of celebrity willingness to let a show make you into a version of yourself that isn't entirely flattering, and Woods supplied that willingness across multiple appearances. Section 7. The episodes that shook things: controversies, bans, and international incidents. Family Guy has spent its entire existence in some proximity to controversy. The Parents Television Council listed it as the worst primetime show for family viewing in 2000, 2005, and 2006. The Federal Communications Commission received a steady stream of complaints and formal petitions asking that the show be blocked from broadcast in its early years. Venezuela banned the show from airing on cable networks in 2008 after the government's justice minister cited a specific episode as an example of the United States promoting drug use through entertainment media. Russia considered a ban in 2014 when an episode drew the ire of Russian officials over content they found offensive to their national dignity. But the deepest controversies, the ones that reveal something true about the show's relationship with its own boundaries, are the stories of the two episodes that never aired in the United States. The first is When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. This episode was produced in 2000, during the show's second season, but was held by Fox for years over concerns that it might be perceived as anti-Semitic. The episode follows Peter, who is struggling with money management and who becomes convinced that Jewish people are inherently better with finances because of a specific cultural stereotype. The episode's entire satirical structure is built on making Peter's belief ridiculous. The humor is about the stupidity of the stereotype, not an endorsement of it. Max Weinstein, the Jewish financial advisor Peter befriends, is a competent, dignified person who is understandably bemused by Peter's assumptions. Fox held the episode from 2000 through 2003, when Adult Swim finally aired it as part of their rerun package. Fox itself didn't air the episode until 2004. 4 years in a drawer for an episode that critics, when they finally saw it, largely praised for its satirical clarity. One of the writers at the time remarked dryly that the show's audience was largely composed of people in dorm rooms and prisons, two demographics that the Nielsen rating system wasn't capturing, and both groups, presumably, were fully capable of recognizing that the episode was making fun of the stereotype rather than advocating for it. The lawsuit that followed When You Wish Upon a Weinstein is one of the stranger footnotes in the show's legal history. The episode contains a song parody called I Need a Jew, set to the melody of When You Wish Upon a Star from the Disney film Pinocchio. The rights holders to the original song filed a lawsuit against Fox and Family Guy for copyright infringement. The case went to court and was decided in favor of Family Guy in 2009, with the ruling recognizing the parody as protected under fair use doctrine. The show's willingness to push into these legal and cultural arguments was, in its own way, part of its identity. It existed at the edge of what broadcast television would permit, and it was occasionally willing to find out exactly where that edge was. The second and more significant non-airing is Partial Terms of Endearment, the final episode of Season 8. This episode dealt directly with abortion, specifically with Lois agreeing to act as a surrogate mother for a college friend. The friend and her husband dying in an accident, and Lois and Peter then grappling with what to do with the pregnancy. Fox president Kevin Riley made the call that the episode would not air in the United States. Adult Swim, when Fox requested that they not air it either, agreed. The episode simply did not exist as far as American television was concerned. It was announced at San Diego Comic-Con in 2009, before Season 8 had even finished airing. MacFarlane and the show's producers sat in front of an audience and told them that one of their episodes would never be seen on American television. The BBC in the United Kingdom aired it on the 20th of June 2010 in primetime, where it was watched in just under 1 million homes. Critics who saw it gave it largely positive reviews. The episode was released on the Season 8 DVD box set, which is the only way American fans have ever been able to see it. The episode remains banned from streaming on Hulu, where Family Guy otherwise has a very complete library. Partial Terms of Endearment is the only episode in the show's history that Disney, the current owner of the Fox library, has explicitly kept off their international streaming platforms as well. It exists in a kind of permanent limbo seen in some countries, available on physical media, but never accessible through the channels through which most people now watch television. The 2008 episode 420, which explored Brian's campaign to legalize marijuana in the show's fictional town, prompted the Venezuelan government's ban. Venezuela's justice minister publicly stated that cable stations in the country would face fines for airing Family Guy after this episode, citing it as an example of American media promoting drug use to younger audiences. The international incident created by a joke about marijuana legalization in an animated comedy about a Rhode Island family is the kind of thing that would be implausible if it weren't documented. The 2013 episode Turban Cowboy, the one that included a cutaway gag showing Peter winning the Boston Marathon by driving his car through the crowd of runners, was pulled from Hulu following the real Boston Marathon bombing in April of that year. The episode had aired in March, barely a month before the actual bombing. The cutaway had no connection to the real event. It was a joke about the race, not about terrorism, but the proximity and time was considered too uncomfortable for the episode to remain freely available. Fox removed it from streaming platforms temporarily, and the episode has had a complicated relationship with accessibility ever since. The show's treatment of religion generated controversy across multiple seasons. The character of God appeared as a recurring figure who was consistently shown as emotionally available, occasionally romantic, and not always in control of situations. Jesus appeared even more regularly, driving his own car, living his own modern life, occasionally confused by the distance between what he actually taught and what gets done in his name. These depictions generated the predictable objections from religious groups, to which the show's creative team responded with the predictable indifference. The Parents Television Council's repeated listings of Family Guy on their worst shows roster created an odd feedback loop. The more the organization condemned the show, the more culturally prominent those condemnations made it. Being on the PTC's worst shows list was, for a certain audience, a recommendation. MacFarlane has spoken about this directly. The organization's opposition to the show functioned as advertising for exactly the demographic that the show was targeting. Young people who found institutional disapproval to be an endorsement rather than a warning. There's a specific quality to the controversy the show generated that distinguishes it from other controversial animated programs. South Park pursues controversy with what appears to be deliberate strategic intent. The show is built around attacking every target with equal irreverence, and its controversies feel calculated. Family Guy's controversies often had an accidental quality. The Boston Marathon episode wasn't calculated to be controversial in retrospect. The Kevin Spacey basement joke wasn't anticipating any controversy at the time it aired. The show's controversial moments tended to arrive through specificity rather than through general provocation, a specific cultural figure, a specific event, a specific topic engaged with at a specific moment in time. The Russia situation bears brief examination as an example of the show's international controversy reaching genuinely diplomatic levels. In 2014, Russian authorities reviewed specific Family Guy episodes and found content they considered offensive to Russian national dignity, most directly related to depictions of the Russian government and military. Legal proceedings were begun in Russian courts to potentially ban the show from broadcast in the country. The show was treated as a matter of some diplomatic delicacy in the context of already strained U.S.-Russia relations during that period. MacFarlane responded to reports of the situation with the specific kind of amusement that comes from being told your animated comedy is a diplomatic incident. The show's relationship with the Catholic Church produced its own long-running controversy. Family Guy has made jokes about Catholicism, about the Church's institutional failures, about specific Catholic figures, with a regularity and specificity that generated formal objections from Catholic advocacy organizations across multiple seasons. MacFarlane, as someone raised Catholic, has discussed his complicated relationship with the Church in various interviews, suggesting that the show's treatment of religion reflects something personal rather than simply opportunistic. The specific knowledge of the Church's traditions and rituals evident in many of the show's religious jokes, the specific liturgical references, the specific institutional critiques supports the interpretation that these jokes come from genuine familiarity with the subject matter. The show's engagement with terrorism and its aftermath is worth noting in this context. Following the 11th of September 2001 attacks, American television went through a period of conservative self-restraint about content that might be considered offensive in the context of the attacks. Family Guy, which had been canceled before the attacks occurred and was in its limbo period during the immediate aftermath, returned to broadcast in 2005 with less sensitivity to this restraint than networks might have preferred. The Boston Marathon episode, the various terrorism-adjacent jokes, the depiction of Osama bin Laden in several episodes, these placed the show in recurring tension with a cultural moment that was still raw. The show's implicit position was that comedy is how culture processes difficulty, and that position was not universally accepted. Carol Burnett filed a lawsuit against Family Guy in 2007 after the show used a character resembling her cleaning lady persona from The Carol Burnett Show in a brief parody scene. The lawsuit claimed the use violated her right of publicity and represented false endorsement. The case was decided in favor of Family Guy in 2007 when a federal judge ruled that the brief parody fell within the protections for comment and criticism under the First Amendment and fair use doctrine. The decision was notable because it established a precedent about the limits of right of publicity claims against clearly satirical uses of public figures. For Family Guy specifically, which routinely incorporated references to real public figures in comedic contexts, the ruling provided important legal clarity about the boundaries of what the show could do. Burnett appealed the decision and lost, and the case became part of the show's legal mythology alongside the Weinstein copyright case. Section 8. The strange machinery of how it gets made. The process of making an episode of Family Guy is considerably longer, more labor-intensive, and more geographically dispersed than most people who watch the show are aware of. From first pitch to finished episode takes roughly 9 months on average. The journey an idea takes from someone's mouth in a writer's room in Los Angeles to the finished animated product that appears on television involves an extraordinary number of people working in multiple countries. It starts in the writer's room. Family Guy's writing staff in its early seasons was small, a tight group assembled by MacFarlane who understood the show's voice and contributed to establishing it. As the show grew through its revival and expanded across more seasons, the writing staff grew too. A modern episode begins as a pitch in the room. Someone describes a story idea, the room discusses it, breaks it down, argues about it, shapes it into something that can support a full episode. This process can take days or weeks for a single story, with writers contributing jokes and cutaways and character moments that get added, discarded, revised, and argued over until a workable structure emerges. Once a script is written and approved, it goes to storyboards. Storyboard artists translate the written script into visual panels that describe what each scene will look like: camera angles, character positions, timing, action. This is where the show starts to become a visual thing rather than a series of words on a page. The storyboards go to an animation director who makes decisions about how the episode should look and move. Then the script goes overseas. Family Guy's animation has been produced by South Korean studios for the majority of its run. The first season used a company called Wong Film Productions, and by the second season, Sunwoo Entertainment, a Seoul-based studio that had also worked on The Simpsons, was doing much of the work. Rough Draft Studios handled seasons 2 and 3, and fans of the show have specific feelings about the Rough Draft era. The animation from those seasons had a looser, more expressive quality that felt more alive than what came later. Characters moved with a particular energy in the Rough Draft episodes that has something to do with the studio's approach to fluidity. After the Rough Draft era, the work passed to Digital Emation, another Seoul-based studio that has been the primary animation provider for the show since season 7. Digital Emation's style is more technically precise, but, in the view of many longtime fans, somewhat stiffer. The characters are drawn more cleanly but move in ways that some viewers find less expressive. The transition is visible if you watch episodes from different eras back to back. Season 3 has a scrappy, hand-drawn energy. Season 10 looks polished but flatter in its movement. The Korean animation studios working on Family Guy are doing an enormous amount of technical work. The scripts and storyboards they receive contain the detailed directions for what needs to happen in each scene, but the actual drawing, every frame, every background, every piece of movement is being executed by teams of animators in Seoul who are working across a significant time zone difference from the Los Angeles production office. This requires elaborate systems for review and revision. Supervising animators and directors at the Los Angeles end receive the work, review it against the storyboards, and return notes that require corrections. The episodes are revised multiple times across this pipeline before they're considered finished. One of the strange details about the Korean animation connection is that the show's longtime series director, Peter Shin, is Korean-American. Shin has directed more Family Guy episodes than anyone else in the show's history, and the connection between the show's directorial leadership and the Korean studios doing its animation is probably not coincidental. The relationship between the show and Korean animation culture has occasionally surfaced in the episodes themselves. A season 14 episode took the Griffin family to Korea, and the commentary on some DVD sets includes jokes about how particularly good Korean animators are at drawing military hardware. The voice recording process, as mentioned, happens separately from the animation. The actors record before the animation is completed, which means the animation is built around the recorded dialogue rather than the other way around. This is different from how live-action acting works, where the actor's physical performance shapes the character's visual presence. In animation, the voice performance comes first, and the visual interpretation follows. The timing of the animation when a character's mouth moves, when their expression changes, when they gesture is calibrated to the pre-recorded audio. The music for Family Guy is a significant and underappreciated aspect of the show's identity. Ron Jones and Walter Murphy have both contributed substantially to the show's musical texture across its run. Murphy, a composer best known outside animation for the disco arrangement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony that became a hit in the 1970s, brought a genuine musical sophistication to the show's underscore and its original songs. Family Guy has always had an unusually high number of original musical numbers for a comedy show, not just songs used as joke delivery mechanisms, but musical sequences that commit to the form with real craft. The Road to Rhode Island musical number from the Season 2 Road to episode is probably the most acclaimed example, but there are dozens of original songs scattered across the show's run that reward attention as musical pieces rather than just as comedy delivery devices. The DVD extras and deleted scenes from Family Guy episodes reveal how much material gets cut in the final editing process. Episodes are typically written and produced with considerably more material than makes it into the 22-minute finished product. The deleted scenes that appear on DVD sets sometimes show alternate versions of jokes, extended cutaways that were trimmed for time, or character moments that were removed from episodes in the interest of pacing. The show that appears on television is always a compressed version of a longer creative process. Section 9. The Road to Episodes, a show within the show. If you wanted to identify the single format within Family Guy that operated at the highest consistent level of quality throughout the show's run, you would pick The Road to Episodes without much hesitation. These special installments, all built around Brian and Stewie leaving the Griffin house and going on some kind of adventure together, function almost as a separate miniseries nested inside the larger show. They have their own aesthetic identity, their own narrative traditions, their own tonal register, and they started as an experiment that nobody was sure would work. The first Road to episode was Road to Rhode Island, which aired on the 30th of May 2000 during the show's second season. Seth MacFarlane has described this episode as an experiment, specifically intended to test whether the unlikely pairing of Brian and Stewie would generate comedic chemistry. Brian was the show's dry voice of reason. Stewie was the show's malevolent supervillain infant. They existed in the same family but had very limited direct interaction in the episodes before this one. MacFarlane wanted to know whether putting these two characters together, locking them in the same story, forcing them to solve problems together, giving them extended dialogue with each other would produce something worth doing again. The answer was decisive. Road to Rhode Island is consistently ranked among the best episodes the show ever produced. It follows Brian going to pick up Stewie from Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt's vacation home in Palm Springs, and the two of them losing their plane tickets and having to travel across the country by other means. Along the way, Brian confronts the circumstances of his own birth. He was born in a puppy mill in Austin, Texas, and the episode takes him back there in a sequence that manages to be genuinely, emotionally affecting without abandoning the comedy. The episode ends with an extended song and dance number performed by Brian and Stewie together, set to a reworking of On the Road to Morocco from the Bob Hope and Bing Crosby Road to Morocco film. The sequence is beautifully animated, the vocal performances are committed, and the whole thing demonstrates that these two characters together could do something that neither of them could do alone. The Road to episode format is a direct homage to The Road to film series that Hope and Crosby made together in the 1940s and 1950s. Those films, Road to Singapore, Road to Zanzibar, Road to Morocco, Road to Utopia, Road to Rio, Road to Bali, followed the same basic structure in each installment. Two characters, a journey, an exotic location, opportunities for songs and comedy. The MacFarlane version preserved the essential structure while updating the form for a contemporary animated context, which meant time travel, multiverse exploration, musical numbers involving dead historical figures, and the specific chemistry of a dog who drinks too much and a baby who builds weapons. All of the early Road to episodes were directed by Dan Povenmire, who brought a specific visual sensibility to them that was different from the show's regular visual style. The Road to episodes have their own title card format, their own opening sequence distinct from the show's regular credits, and their own musical themes that signal immediately to the viewer that this episode is operating in a different register. Povenmire went on to co-create Phineas and Ferb for Disney, and the visual creativity he brought to the Road to episodes was clearly a preview of what he was capable of when given room to develop a distinctive aesthetic. Road to Europe, the second Road to episode, aired in Season 3, and sent Brian and Stewie to Europe in pursuit of Stewie's obsession with the fictional British children's television character Jolly Farm Review. The episode is notable for a specific musical sequence involving Stewie tap dancing with Gene Kelly, or rather, with footage of Gene Kelly, incorporating the animated Stewie into a scene from the 1945 film Anchors Away, where Kelly's character originally danced with Jerry Mouse from Tom and Jerry. The sequence required convincing Gene Kelly's estate to grant permission for the use, and the technical animation work involved in making a Family Guy character appear to move in the same space as Kelly's 1945 film footage was considerable. It's one of those moments in the show's history where the ambition of the execution exceeded what you'd expect from an animated comedy. Road to Rupert, airing in Season 5, sent Brian and Stewie to Colorado in pursuit of Stewie's beloved teddy bear Rupert, who had been accidentally sold at a yard sale. The episode is notable for the depth of feeling it produced around the relationship between Stewie and his bear. Rupert, as discussed, is not a real character. He doesn't do anything, he doesn't speak, he has no agency. But Stewie's attachment to him is treated in this episode with complete sincerity, and the recovery of Rupert at the end of the episode is played as a genuine emotional reunion. The show managed to make you care about the fate of a stuffed animal, which requires establishing a relationship with a prop with enough specificity and consistency that the prop becomes emotionally legible. Road to Germany from Season 7 is the darkest of the Road to episodes, sending Stewie and Brian back to 1939 Poland, the day Germany invaded, triggering the Second World War after Mort Goldman accidentally uses Stewie's time machine. The episode navigates its extraordinarily difficult subject matter through specific tonal choices. It acknowledges the horror of the historical context without making comedy of the horror itself, while finding the comedy in the specific predicament of two characters from 2008, suddenly embedded in 1939 with Mort Goldman, who happens to be Jewish. The episode has a scene where Brian and Stewie attempt to acquire period-appropriate documents and end up face-to-face with Adolf Hitler, which is staged as a direct parody of the famous I Love Lucy chocolate factory scene. Somehow it works. Road to the Multiverse, from Season 8, is widely considered the peak of the entire Road to format. Stewie has developed a remote control that can jump between parallel universes, and the episode explores an extraordinary range of visual styles as Brian and Stewie hop between realities. One universe is animated in the style of classic Disney films. One is animated in the style of Japanese anime. One depicts a world where Christianity never developed and history took an entirely different course, technologically speaking. One is a universe where everything looks like a crude video game. The Disney-esque universe sequence in particular is one of the most impressive pieces of animation the show ever produced. It's a perfect technical capture of the Disney aesthetic, down to the specific character movements and color palette and orchestral scoring style. The Road to episodes also contains some of the show's most emotionally direct moments. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie, while not technically a Road to episode, functions as an extension of that dynamic. In it, Brian and Stewie are trapped overnight in a bank vault, and the episode is essentially one long, unbroken conversation between them. No cutaways, no other characters, no subplot. Just these two people, a dog and a baby, talking honestly about who they are and what they feel about their lives. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because he has, at various points, considered using it to end his own life. Stewie tells Brian, with complete sincerity, how much Brian means to him. It's one of the rawest, most direct emotional exchanges in the show's history, and it required the Road to format's willingness to let these characters carry a full episode on the strength of their relationship alone. The Road to brand also generated some of the show's most ambitious crossover moments. Road to the North Pole sent Brian and Stewie to find Santa Claus, after Stewie became determined to confront him about the inadequacy of the previous year's gifts. What they found was a dark, sprawling horror comedy vision of the North Pole as an industrial nightmare, with Santa Claus reduced to a desperate, half-mad figure trying to fulfill increasingly impossible demands. The episode is probably the most tonally adventurous Christmas special in the show's history, balancing genuine bleakness with the specific comedy of Brian and Stewie trying to navigate a situation that's gotten completely out of hand. Section 10. The Prophecy's Family Guy's uncanny habit of predicting things. There's a category of television history that belongs almost entirely to animated shows, and it concerns the strange frequency with which specific jokes and scenarios in animated comedies appear to predict real events that happen years later. The Simpsons is most commonly discussed in this context. Family Guy has its own version of this phenomenon, and several of the show's apparent predictions are genuinely difficult to explain away as pure coincidence. The most widely discussed is the Caitlyn Jenner prediction. In a 2009 episode, Brian and Stewie encounter Brody Jenner, the son of the then-named Bruce Jenner, and Stewie makes a specific comment about his parentage. Bruce Jenner is a woman, Stewie says, an elegant, beautiful Dutch woman. Brian tells him that's not true, that Bruce Jenner is a man. Stewie replies, "That's what the press would have you believe." In 2015, 6 years after that episode aired, Bruce Jenner publicly came out as transgender and began her transition to Caitlyn Jenner, revealing an identity that Stewie Griffin had apparently described with casual, matter-of-fact accuracy in a 2009 episode. The Dutch part wasn't accurate. Everything else was. Seth MacFarlane has stated that the writers had no inside knowledge about Jenner's identity. The joke was written based on existing public interest in the Jenner family's various reality television appearances, and it happened to describe what was actually true by accident. The Boston Marathon episode is a darker kind of apparent prediction. Turban Cowboy, which aired in March 2013, included a cutaway gag showing Peter winning the Boston Marathon by driving his car through the field of runners. On the 15th of April, 2013, roughly 1 month after the episode aired, bombs went off near the finish line of the real Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring several hundred. The proximity was considered close enough and uncomfortable enough that Fox pulled the episode from streaming platforms. The cutaway had nothing to do with terrorism. It was a joke about Peter cheating at a race. But the combination of the Boston Marathon setting and the mass casualty element was too difficult to sit with given the timing of the real event. The Robin Williams episode created one of the most chilling real-world coincidences in the show's history. Season 10 included an episode where Peter is given the power to transform everything he touches into Robin Williams characters. The segment is called Fatman and Robin, and it's played as a wish-gone-wrong story, with Peter's power becoming increasingly overwhelming. At one point in the episode, Peter considers taking his own life as a way to end the situation. On the 12th of August 2014, BBC Three in the United Kingdom aired this episode. Immediately after the episode concluded and the channel cut to news, the broadcaster reported that Robin Williams had died that day from suicide. The episode, which included a character considering suicide and invoked Robin Williams throughout, aired back-to-back with the news of Robin Williams' actual death in the UK on the same day. The Kevin Spacey prediction is simultaneously the most uncomfortable and the one with the clearest documentary record of being accidental. In a 2005 episode, Stewie runs through a department store screaming that he has escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement. The joke was written and aired in 2005. In 2017, actor Anthony Rapp publicly described an incident from 1,986 inches which Kevin Spacey had made unwanted sexual advances toward him when Rapp was underage. The subsequent reporting revealed a pattern of behavior that matched what the Family Guy joke had described, without any factual basis for the joke having existed in 2005. MacFarlane stated directly that the writers had no knowledge of Spacey's actual behavior. The joke was completely random. It became retroactively and deeply uncomfortable. The show has also touched on anti-vaccination arguments years before they became a dominant public health controversy, shown characters using technology that didn't exist yet, and referenced cultural moments in ways that occasionally turned out to be accurate descriptions of things that hadn't happened. Some of these can be explained by the show drawing on emerging cultural trends and extrapolating where they might lead. Good satirical writing tends to identify where things are heading before they arrive. Others, like the Jenner prediction, are harder to explain through that lens. The phenomenon is partly an artifact of the show's enormous catalog. Family Guy has produced more than 350 episodes across its run. With that volume of specific cultural content, statistical probability alone guarantees that some percentage of specific jokes will coincide with real events. But the specificity of certain coincidences, particularly the Jenner prediction, which was accurate in a way that probability alone doesn't fully account for, continues to generate discussion. There's a version of the explanation that attributes some of these to the show's writing room being plugged into Hollywood and entertainment industry gossip in ways that general audiences weren't. The Kevin Spacey joke was supposedly random, but Hollywood is a small town in certain respects, and things that aren't yet public knowledge sometimes exist as private knowledge within that community. MacFarlane has stated categorically that the writers had no actual knowledge. That categorical denial is the end of the evidentiary record. What the prediction phenomenon actually illustrates, more than anything about Family Guy specifically, is how effective, sustained, high-volume cultural satire can be at identifying patterns and trajectories in public life. A show that has been making jokes about celebrity culture, political behavior, and social trends for more than 2 decades has accumulated a large enough catalog that some of its observations will, eventually, be validated by real events. The surprise isn't that it happens. The surprise is how specific some of the instances turn out to be. Section 11. The characters that almost were cut ideas, abandoned arcs, and what might have been. Every show that reaches a multi-season run carries within it the ghost of other versions of itself. The ideas that were tried and abandoned, the characters that were developed and cut, the story directions that were mapped and then left unexplored. Family Guy's production history is full of these. The show that aired was constantly in dialogue with versions of itself that never made it to screen. The death character, the Grim Reaper, voiced by Adam Carolla, was originally conceived in a much more central role. The early development of Family Guy included the concept of death appearing in every single episode, a constant background presence in the Griffin family's world. The idea was that mortality was always nearby, that the ordinary chaos of the Griffin household existed in perpetual proximity to the ultimate stakes of life and death. Death would have been a recurring figure, visible in the margins of domestic scenes, occasionally interacting with the family, always present as a reminder that all of this ridiculous business is happening against the backdrop of real consequence. The concept was scaled back very early. Death appeared in the Season 1 episode Death is a Bitch, which established his character, and in several subsequent episodes, but the idea of him as a constant background presence was abandoned before it was fully realized. The version that survived into the show is a much more conventional portrayal. Death shows up when the plot requires a supernatural element, has specific interactions with Peter, and then disappears. The darker, more ambient version of the character that was originally envisioned would have given the show a different texture, something darker and stranger running underneath the domestic comedy. There were early discussions about making Meg a more central character in the show's first season. The concept of Meg as the audience surrogate, the character through whose eyes the show's events were filtered, the relatable outsider in an unusual family, was genuinely explored in early development. The show that existed in those discussions had a stronger narrative perspective tied to Meg's experience, using her outsider position in her own family as the consistent lens through which the show's world was seen. This concept was walked back as the show's tone developed, and Meg was gradually repositioned as a background character and eventually, as discussed at length in the transcript provided, as the target of the family's sustained unkindness. The character of Stewie was, in the very earliest drafts of the show's development, conceived as significantly darker. The version of Stewie that appeared in the first episode was already a departure from an even more extreme version, a baby character whose plans for world domination and maternal murder were played with a specificity and a seriousness that the network found too dark for what they imagined as a family comedy context. MacFarlane calibrated the character during the pilot period, finding the version of Stewie that was dark enough to be funny without being so genuinely threatening that the character became impossible to spend time with. The calibration was difficult, and the result was specific. Early Stewie exists in a precise band between menace and absurdity that was deliberately engineered. There were story arcs developed across multiple seasons that were mapped extensively and then never completed. Meg's character, in the mid to late seasons, had several larger arcs in development that would have given her genuine progression and resolution. The show's writing staff has discussed, in various interviews and panels, storylines that would have fundamentally altered Meg's position in the family and given her the kind of character development that would have made the earlier seasons of her suffering narratively meaningful rather than simply unpleasant. These arcs were written, discussed, and in some cases partially produced before being discarded when the creative direction changed or when the show's reset button narrative structure made them difficult to execute. The character of Quagmire had a backstory that was developed in considerably more detail than was ever shown on screen. The explanation for why Quagmire behaves the way he does, and it's an explanation that would have provided genuine character depth while complicating the comedy considerably, was sketched out in the writer's room but never fully committed to in the episodes. The version of Quagmire that was most developed conceptually is darker and sadder than the one that appears most often on screen, a character whose behavior reflects something specific about his history that the show has gestured at but never directly examined. Peter's biological father, a separate character from Francis, the stepfather who raised him, was revealed in a later season episode and brought into the show as a recurring presence. The backstory of Peter's real parentage and the exploration of what that meant for his identity was treated as significant story territory in the episodes that addressed it, but the arc was never pursued to any real conclusion. The show introduced the element and then circled it without committing to the kind of sustained character exploration that the revelation could have supported. There are also the cutaway gags that didn't make it. Family Guy's writers have discussed, at various conventions and in various interviews, the volume of cutaway material that was written and cut during the production of every episode. An episode might be written with twice as many cutaways as will actually appear in the finished version. The selection process for which cutaways survive to the finished episode involves a kind of triage of comedy, which gags are funniest, which serve the episode's narrative needs, which feel gratuitous, which will age well or poorly. The gags that don't make it to screen include some that were considered too dark, some that were considered not funny enough, and some that were considered funny but too tangential even for a show that celebrates tangentiality. The Cleveland Show, the spin-off that ran from 2009 to 2013, began as a very different concept than what aired. The original pitch was for a spin-off centered on Quagmire rather than Cleveland. There were extensive discussions about what a Quagmire spin-off would look like, what kind of stories it could tell, how the character would work as the center of a show rather than as a supporting presence in The Drunken Clam. The concept was ultimately set aside in favor of Cleveland, partly because the Cleveland character offered a more domestic scenario that could support the family sitcom format. The Quagmire spin-off that was discussed would have been a significantly different animal, more adult, more uncomfortable in its comic premise, harder to build a broader audience around. Section 12. What It Left Behind. Legacy, Strange Theories, and the Show That Kept Going. 25 years after that first episode aired following Super Bowl 33, Family Guy has accumulated a legacy that is both enormous and complicated. The show changed American animation in specific, documentable ways. It demonstrated that there was an audience for adult animated comedy that went beyond The Simpsons model. It built a model for how a canceled show could be revived through non-traditional means. It pioneered the viral clip format for television comedy in the pre-YouTube era, and then thrived on YouTube after YouTube arrived. It influenced the way a generation of comedic writers thought about structure, timing, and the relationship between a main narrative and digressive comic material. It created a universe whose internal mythology is deep enough to support years of fan theorizing. The fan theory community around Family Guy has produced some genuinely interesting frameworks for understanding the show's internal logic. The most sustained and compelling of these is the theory that the entire show takes place inside Stewie's perception. The world we see in Family Guy, according to this theory, is not a neutral representation of events. It's the world as filtered through the consciousness of an infant. Everything is slightly larger than life, slightly more absurd, slightly more extreme than it would be in unmediated reality. The adults who ignore Stewie, who hear his elaborate speeches and apparently register them as baby babbling, aren't choosing to ignore him. They simply cannot hear what the audience hears, because what the audience hears is Stewie's internal experience of his own speech, not the actual sound that comes out of his mouth. Under this reading, Brian's ability to communicate with Stewie isn't because Brian is unusual in some metaphysical sense. It's because, in Stewie's perception of the world, the family dog is the only other member of the household who operates at Stewie's level. The other family members, loud, large, chaotic, not particularly attentive, register in Stewie's consciousness as the exaggerated figures his limited perspective would logically produce. Peter is incomprehensible because infants cannot understand adult motivations. Lois is alternately comforting and threatening because that's the structure of a baby's relationship with a primary caregiver. The cutaway gags, under this theory, are literally that the audience is cutting away into Stewie's associative mind, following his infant brain as it connects one idea to another. Seth MacFarlane himself has offered the clearest official answer to the question of who can understand Stewie, which is that everyone can hear and understand him. They simply don't take him seriously because he's a baby, and parents in particular have a tendency to filter out their children's chatter as noise. Under this reading, the moments when Lois appears not to hear Stewie aren't about sound, they're about attention. He's always speaking. She's not always listening. The joke of Stewie delivering a full-length monologue about his dark intentions while Lois hums along changing his diaper is a joke about what parents choose not to hear, not about any failure of literal communication. Another theory concerns the show's two distinct eras, the pre-cancellation seasons 1 through 3 and the post-revival seasons 4 onward, as existing in separate continuities. This theory, developed by various Reddit users and fan forums, points to the observable differences between the show's two eras as evidence that they're not quite the same universe. In the pre-cancellation seasons, Meg is genuinely loved by her family. Peter is genuinely lovable. The family's warmth is real and consistent. After the revival, these things change. Under the two-continuity theory, what happened during the show's cancellation in the narrative is what the Road to the Multiverse episode later confirmed: there are multiple versions of this universe, and the 2005 return to television brought the audience to a parallel version of the Griffins, rather than a continuation of the originals. This theory is particularly interesting because the Road to episodes have, on several occasions, visited the universe of the original show. In Back to the Pilot, Brian and Stewie use time travel to visit the events of the first episode, and what they observe is noticeably different from the world they currently inhabit. The theory proposes that they aren't traveling in time at all, they're crossing between universes. The writers would likely say this is overthinking a gag about nostalgia, but the internal logic of the show doesn't entirely contradict it. The theory about Brian's alcoholism as an explanation for his character deterioration has been developed in some detail. The argument is that the changes in Brian's personality across the show's run, the increasing self-absorption, the declining ability to sustain genuine relationships, the growing gap between his self-image and his actual behavior, track the progression of alcohol use disorder with a degree of accuracy that might be accidental, but is certainly interesting. Brian in the early seasons drinks, but his drinking is a character detail rather than a character-defining trait. By the later seasons, Brian's drinking is nearly constant, and his behavior shows the specific patterns of someone whose judgment and empathy have been progressively impaired by sustained heavy alcohol use. The show never explicitly makes this argument, but the evidence for it in the episodes is consistent enough that it functions as a reasonable interpretive framework. Family Guy's cultural impact extends well beyond the show itself. The specific format of the cutaway gag became so associated with the show that it influenced an entire generation of comedy writing, for better and worse. Shows that followed, Family Guy tried to replicate the cutaway structure and ended up mostly demonstrating how difficult it is to do cutaways, while the form requires a specific kind of writing that can generate genuinely funny, disconnected material in volume, and most shows that tried it couldn't sustain the quality. The cutaway as a comic device exists in the television vocabulary in ways it didn't before Family Guy, and the show's success with the format in its early years is the reason other shows tried it. The show's relationship with music is a legacy element that doesn't get discussed enough. Family Guy produced an extraordinary number of original songs across its run, many of which are genuinely good as songs independently of their comedic context. Everything's Better with a Bag of Weed, the show's extraordinarily committed musical number from a season 7 episode, is a fully realized production number that works as parody and as an actual expression of the specific musical grammar it's drawing from. The Road to Rhode Island sequence is excellent musical theater. The various original songs written for Stewie across the seasons demonstrate a compositional intelligence that goes beyond what most animated comedies attempt. Walter Murphy, who arranged the show's music, brought a level of musical sophistication to the project that the show largely took for granted. The show's nominations at the Emmys represent a high watermark that the show itself seemed not entirely to believe. In 2009, Family Guy became only the second animated series ever to be nominated for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series, the first being The Flintstones back in 1961. Not The Simpsons, The Flintstones. Family Guy? The show that had been canceled twice and brought back through DVD sales was nominated for the most prestigious award in American television comedy. The nomination acknowledged something real about what the show was capable of in its best moments, a kind of comedic ambition and emotional range that the Emmy category didn't usually associate with animation. The show's current position renewed through season 27, which would carry it to the 2028 to 2029 television season, and coincide with its 30th anniversary, is a monument to commercial durability, if not consistently to creative vitality. A show that began as a 24-year-old's thesis film expanded into a real undergraduate sketch, which expanded into a network pitch, which became a canceled show, which became a cultural phenomenon, which became the longest-running animated comedy on American television by some measures, airing every season regardless of ratings, will continue to exist because it is economical to produce, because it has value in streaming and reruns and merchandise, and because the audience for it, however diminished from its peak, remains real and committed. The fans who watch it today, some of them, the oldest ones, watched the premiere in 1999. They watched the Adult Swim reruns in 2003. They bought the DVDs that brought the show back. They watched the revival in 2005 with the specific excitement of people who had done something to make it happen. They watched the show change over the following decades, arguing with each other about whether it was still good, whether it had ever stopped being good, whether their feelings about it were about the show or about themselves having changed. They've been watching it, in one form or another, for longer than some of their children have been alive. The show is, at its core, a fairly simple idea executed with extraordinary specificity in its best moments. A family in Rhode Island. A dog who talks. A baby who builds weapons. A man whose voice came from a security guard at an art school. These are the materials from which something that changed American television was made, and the fact that they started as a college thesis film shown to a professor who happened to know someone at Hanna-Barbera is one of those origin stories that makes more sense in hindsight than it would have seemed reasonable to predict at the time. The show's specific cultural moment, the late 1990s and early 2000s, the era between the internet becoming widespread and social media defining everything, created a specific kind of audience for what Family Guy was offering. This was the audience of late-night cable television, of DVD extras, of college dorms where shows were shared through physical media rather than algorithmic recommendation. The Family Guy audience of 2005 found the show the way people found things before algorithms found things for them, through someone telling someone else, through stumbling across it on Adult Swim, through picking up the DVD set at a store because the cover looked interesting. There's a specific quality to cultural discovery made through friction that creates a different relationship between audience and content than discovery through algorithmic suggestion. The Family Guy audience of the revival era found the show and chose it, actively, rather than having it presented to them as something they were likely to enjoy. 25 years is a long time for anything to keep going. The fact that Family Guy is still here, still generating new episodes, still occupying a recognizable position in American popular culture, is itself a kind of strange fact. One more item in the collection of strange facts that the show has accumulated across its extraordinary, improbable, frustrating, frequently brilliant run. The Griffins are still at 31 Spooner Street. The sheet music above Lois's piano still says what it says. Stewie still carries something dark underneath his yellow shirt. Brian's voice is still Seth MacFarlane's natural voice, talking the way he actually talks. And somewhere in an animation studio in Seoul, people are still drawing the same faces they've been drawing since the late 1990s, putting them in motion, sending them back across the ocean to a production office in Los Angeles, where someone is still deciding which jokes are funny enough to keep. That's the strange machine that produces the show. It has been running for a very long time. And the strangest part of the whole story isn't any single fact about any single character or any single episode. The strangest part is that a 24-year-old's thesis film, 11 minutes of hand-drawn animation, featuring a man named Larry and his dog Steve, made in a college dormitory in Rhode Island in 1995, eventually became one of the longest-running animated comedies in the history of American television, watched by hundreds of millions of people across multiple continents and multiple generations, argued about and beloved and criticized and defended and quoted and referenced and remembered in ways that the person who made it probably could not have imagined when he was just trying to make something good enough to show his professor, if you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely, there's something I find really peaceful about going deep on a topic like this, late at night, with nowhere you have to be. If you're watching from somewhere interesting, a different country, a weird time zone, somewhere with rain on the windows, drop that in the comments. And if you got something out of this video, a subscription means a lot. It keeps this going. Take care of yourself, sleep well. Section 13. The mythology of the drunken clam, the supporting cast and their secrets. One of the things that separates Family Guy from a show that merely has recurring characters is that its universe has genuine internal depth. The town the Griffins live in isn't just a backdrop. It's a place with its own rules, its own recurring personalities, its own accumulated history of strange events. And understanding the supporting cast, the people beyond the Griffin household, is the only way to fully appreciate how specifically and carefully that universe was constructed. The Drunken Clam is the most important location in this world, after 31 Spooner Street. It's the bar where Peter, Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire gather, where arguments begin and end, where the men of the neighborhood retreat from domestic reality into the specific comfort of cold beer and low expectations. The bar exists in a very particular tradition of the neighborhood tavern as social institution, not fancy, not aspirational, just a place where the same people sit in the same seats and order the same things and feel, temporarily, that the world is manageable. In the early seasons, the Drunken Clam had a warmth that matched the warmth the show had more broadly. The four men around that table were genuinely friends, in a specific and recognizable way. Glenn Quagmire's full name, revealed at various points across the show's run, is Glenn Quagglechek. He changed it, which tells you something about the relationship between who he is and who he presents himself as being. He works as an airline pilot, which the show established early and mostly treats as background information rather than a source of actual story. But the contrast between Quagmire's professional role, demanding certification, discipline, the responsibility of hundreds of passengers' lives, and his personal behavior, which operates with none of those qualities, is a persistent ironic tension that the show was always aware of even when it didn't explicitly address it. The detail about Quagmire's age, revealed in a Season 8 episode called Foxy Lady, is one of the stranger facts in the show's accumulated mythology. When asked his age in that episode, Quagmire states that he is 61 years old. This would make him, physically, around the same age as Peter and Joe and Cleveland men, who are presumably in their mid to late 30s. The show provides no explanation for this discrepancy. Quagmire looks 40 at the outside. He moves like someone 20 years younger. He is, according to his own testimony, 61. The show never revisits or explains the detail. It simply exists out there, an unexplained fact about a character who has been present since the first episode. In a later episode, a palm reading by a character named Madame Claude tells Quagmire that he was Jack the Ripper in a past life. This is delivered as a throwaway comedic moment. But given everything we know about the character's behavior in the present day, it functions as a more pointed observation than it might at first appear. The show was often doing two things at once, with Quagmire playing his behavior as broad comedy while simultaneously sketching the outline of someone whose actions, taken literally rather than satirically, describe genuine harm. The Jack the Ripper detail is one of several moments where the show allowed that darker subtext to surface briefly before covering it back up with a laugh. Joe Swanson's backstory has been revised across the show's run in ways that create internal contradictions. The most consistent version establishes that Joe was injured while trying to stop a criminal on Christmas Eve, who hit him with a pipe and subsequently shot him. This origin story was told in the Season 1 episode A Hero Sits Next Door, and established Joe as someone who had been genuinely heroic before his injury, which was what made him the object of the neighborhood's admiration. The contrast between what Joe was and what his situation has made him, or at least what the later show makes of his situation, is one of the more genuinely affecting undertones in the show's early seasons. Joe's wife Bonnie was pregnant for the first 116 episodes of the show. That is a remarkable and somewhat vertiginous number. For roughly 8 seasons, Bonnie Swanson was visibly, immovably pregnant, attending every neighborhood event and dinner in the same condition, never progressing, never delivering. When Bonnie finally gave birth in the season 6 episode Ocean's 3.5, the baby, a girl named Susie, was born after what the show had implicitly established as a multi-year pregnancy. The show's internal time structure is famously inconsistent, but the sheer duration of Bonnie's pregnancy across seasons and years of broadcast is one of the more peculiar running details in the series. Bonnie Swanson is voiced by Jennifer Tilly, whose distinctive, high-breathy voice gives the character a quality of perpetually suppressed something. It's never entirely clear whether Bonnie is completely fine or on the verge of a quiet breakdown, and Tilly's voice captures that ambiguity with remarkable consistency. Cleveland Brown, in the years before he departed for his own spin-off show, was one of the more underwritten major recurring characters in Family Guy. He was defined primarily by his extremely measured, slow, deliberate speech pattern, a conscious choice that put him at a specific kind of comic distance from the situations he found himself in. Cleveland never reacted at the same speed as events around him. By the time he had processed what was happening, the situation had usually moved on, and his response was delivered into the aftermath of something that no longer quite required it. This temporal displacement was his comedy, and it was a very specific type of comedy that the show used consistently without ever quite developing into a larger character statement. Cleveland's departure for The Cleveland Show left a gap in the drunken clam dynamic that the show addressed by elevating Joe and Quagmire in the group's comedic structure. When Cleveland returned in the season 13 episode He's Blah Ack, the group dynamic had been reorganized in ways that didn't fully accommodate his return, and the character spent several subsequent seasons in a somewhat uncertain position within the ensemble. Mike Henry voiced Cleveland from the beginning until 2020, at which point, as mentioned, he stepped away from the role. Arif Zahir took over, and the character has continued with a new vocal energy that carries forward the character's essential qualities while sounding noticeably different to longtime viewers. The supporting characters of the town extend well beyond the immediate neighborhood. Tom Tucker, the local news anchor voiced by Seth MacFarlane, appeared from the first season onward and accumulated his own strange mythology across the show's run. His relationship with co-anchor Diane Simmons, played by Lori Allen, became one of the show's more unexpectedly dark subplots when Diane was killed off in a season 9 episode, in a sequence that committed to genuine, dramatic stakes in a way that surprised viewers who had taken her as furniture. The death was plotted as a full mystery episode, with Diane as the murderer of various characters before being sniped by Stewie in a conclusion that played like a real thriller rather than a comedy beat. It was one of those episodes that demonstrated what the show could do when it decided to commit to something unexpected. Adam West, the actual Adam West, former star of the 1960s Batman television series, played the mayor of the show's fictional town as a recurring character from the show's 3rd season until West's death in 2017. The character was named Mayor Adam West, and his behavior was a sustained, deliberately absurd portrait of someone who had detached entirely from reality. He collected gold, he was afraid of invisible cars, he had unexplained feuds with cats. West himself leaned into the material with absolute commitment, delivering the most unhinged lines with total deadpan conviction. His willingness to create a comedically grotesque version of himself for this role was a gift to the show that the show used generously. After West's death, the character was written out of the show with a tribute episode that the show's producers made with genuine affection for the man who had been part of their world for 14 years. Herbert the elderly man, the uncomfortable neighbor voiced by Mike Henry, represents one of the show's most complicated creative decisions. The character is clearly a satire of a specific kind of predatory adult behavior directed at children. The show uses him as a source of dark comedy, staging scenes where the horror of what he represents is played as absurdist comedy rather than confronted directly. Some viewers found this approach offensive. Others found the character's very existence as a neighborhood fixture visible, completely unaddressed by the community around him, persistent in his existence to be a more accurate representation of how communities fail to protect children than more explicit treatments would be. The character is one that the show never quite resolved, returning to again and again without ever deciding what it actually wanted to say about what it was depicting. Quahog's news team extends beyond Tucker to include Tricia Takanawa, the Asian-American reporter voiced by Alex Borstein. Borstein playing both Lois and Tricia Takanawa, two characters who exist in the same show's universe and occasionally occupy the same scenes, is a detail that the show has occasionally acknowledged through jokes about how remarkably similar the two voices sound. The character of Ollie Williams, the African-American weatherman whose entire function is to deliver the show's weather reports in extremely brief, shouted statements, is one of the cleanest single-joke recurring characters in the show's history. His appearances are always brief, always exactly what you expect, and always land. The joke is the simplicity of the joke. The Quahog universe is populated by dozens of recurring characters who have accumulated their own small mythologies. Neil Goldman, named after a show writer, is Meg's persistent admirer, whose one-sided devotion to a character who can't persuade the world to notice her creates a particular kind of comedy. Neil sees in Meg exactly the qualities that the rest of the show refuses to acknowledge she has, and his adoration exists as a kind of quiet counter-argument to the show's dominant treatment of her. The Goldman family, including Neil's father Mort, who is voiced by John G. Brennan, became one of the show's more extensively developed recurring families beyond the Griffins themselves, with Mort's various neuroses and anxieties providing material across multiple seasons. Section 14. Strange records, odd numbers, and the facts that live in the details. Family Guy exists in a specific space in television history, and the numbers and records associated with it tell a story that narrative alone can't fully capture. Some of these facts are famous. Others are less commonly known but equally interesting. Taken together, they sketch the outline of a show that has always occupied an unusual position in the landscape of American entertainment. The show premiered to approximately 22 million viewers on the 31st of January 1999. That number has been cited so often that it risks becoming abstract. To put it in perspective, in 2023, roughly 24 years later, Family Guy was averaging around 723,000 viewers for new episodes. The journey from 22 million to 723,000 represents a loss of roughly 96% of the peak audience across the show's run. Virtually no other television program in history has sustained this kind of audience erosion while continuing to be produced and renewed. The show's continued existence in the face of this decline says something specific about the economics of animation, about the value of intellectual property beyond its first-run ratings, and about the specific mathematics that allow a show to be commercially viable even when its viewership has shrunk to a fraction of what it once was. The Emmy nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series in 2009 was, as mentioned, only the second such nomination for an animated series since The Flintstones in 1961. The Flintstones won that Emmy. Family Guy was nominated but did not win. The category that year included 30 Rock, Entourage, Flight of the Conchords, The Office, and Weeds. The presence of Family Guy in that list, alongside those specific shows, represents a moment in the show's critical reception that now feels like a historical artifact. The show was considered seriously enough in 2009 to compete in the comedy series category against prestige live-action television. By the time season 20 aired, this seemed difficult to believe. The DVD sales record set by Family Guy in 2003 needs some context to fully understand. The television DVD market in 2003 was at the peak of its significance as a commercial format. Streaming did not exist as a meaningful delivery mechanism for television content. Home video releases of television series were the primary way audiences could access content they had missed or wanted to revisit. In that context, selling 2.2 million copies of the Season 1 and Season 2 sets, becoming the second best-selling television DVD set of all time, was an extraordinary commercial performance for a show that had been canceled. The only television DVD that had sold better was the first season of Chappelle's Show from Comedy Central, which had the advantage of being a currently airing show at the time of its release rather than an archived canceled one. Family Guy holds the informal record of having influenced more subsequent animated shows for better and worse than perhaps any single animated comedy in the post-Simpsons era. The specific format of the cutaway gag was widely imitated across the 2000s and 2010s, appearing in shows that tried to capture the same casual energy and mostly demonstrated that the energy was harder to reproduce than it looked. The show also established a model for adult animated comedy that specifically departed from The Simpsons' approach of grounding comedy in genuine character relationships. Where The Simpsons built its comedy on a foundation of specific character dynamics and emotional truth, Family Guy demonstrated that there was a substantial audience for comedy that operated more freely, more randomly, less interested in continuity or consequence. The debate about which model serves comedy better has been ongoing since 2005 and will probably not be resolved. The number of original songs produced by Family Guy across its run is extraordinary. The show has produced well over 100 original musical compositions across its 25-plus year run, ranging from full musical theater production numbers to brief 30-second parody songs to extended comedic ballads. This musical output exceeds that of most dedicated musical television series. The quality varies enormously, but at its best, the Road to Episode musical numbers, the various Stewie solo compositions, the orchestrated production numbers in the Halloween and Christmas specials Family Guy demonstrated a genuine musical ambition that most animated comedies never attempted. The show's physical merchandise output is another data point that illuminates its sustained commercial relevance. Family Guy has generated merchandise across an extraordinary range of categories: action figures, bobbleheads, clothing, video games, board games, mobile games, pinball machines, themed food products, holiday ornaments, and dozens of other categories. The video game history alone, including titles like Family Guy, Back to the Multiverse, which received quite poor reviews but still sold significantly, demonstrates the commercial weight of the brand beyond its television presence. The show exists as a franchise in a way that few animated comedies have managed to sustain for this long. The show's international reach has created some specific cultural peculiarities. Family Guy is broadcast in dozens of countries and has been dubbed into multiple languages. The specific challenge of dubbing a show whose comedy is built on pop culture references to American entertainment, American political figures, and American cultural history has produced some genuinely creative localization solutions in foreign markets, where jokes about specific American celebrities are routinely substituted with jokes about local celebrities familiar to those audiences. The Conway Twitty gags, which are specifically unfunny in an entirely American way, required particular creativity to translate into markets where Conway Twitty is not a household name. The show's relationship with Fox's network censors has generated its own historical record. The standards and practices process through which every episode of Family Guy passes before broadcast has resulted in an enormous body of negotiated compromises, enforced cuts, required revisions, and occasional outright rejections. MacFarlane has discussed this process in various interviews, describing the creative tension between the show's ambition to push content limits and the network's obligation to maintain broadcast standards. The Adult Swim versions of early episodes, as mentioned, contained material that didn't make it past Fox's censors for the broadcast versions. Additional evidence that the show that aired was always a moderated version of the show that was initially conceived. Family Guy has won 9 Primetime Emmy Awards across its run, including the one MacFarlane received in 2000 for Outstanding Voiceover Performance for Stewie. The show has also received Emmy nominations in categories including Outstanding Animated Program, Outstanding Original Music and Lyrics, and Outstanding Sound Editing. The episode Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows from Season 3 won a Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Original Music and Lyrics, a surprising choice given that the episode is, by the show's own admission, not among its most celebrated episodes overall. The win was credited largely to the musical craft of the show's composers, who created something in that specific episode that the Emmy voters found genuinely distinguished. The show's relationship with the Super Bowl is one of the more interesting closed loops in its history. Family Guy premiered after the Super Bowl in 1999 and drew its largest single-episode audience from the spillover of viewers who stayed on Fox after the game ended. 26 years later, the show continues to air on Fox, the network that broadcasts the Super Bowl in the United States on a rotating basis. The Super Bowl and Family Guy share a network home and a connection that has become circular. The show that got its biggest audience from the Super Bowl now sometimes airs directly before or after Super Bowl programming, closing a loop that began with that first 2 million viewer night in 1999. The show's time on streaming platforms has created its own data record. Family Guy has been streaming on Hulu since 2011, making it one of the earlier major network shows to establish a sustained streaming presence. The show's streaming numbers are, by various estimates, significantly higher than its broadcast ratings, meaning that substantially more people watch Family Guy through Hulu and other digital platforms than watch it on Fox's Wednesday night broadcast. This inverted relationship between broadcast and streaming numbers is common for long-running library shows, but Family Guy's version of this phenomenon is particularly dramatic. The show that barely draws 700,000 broadcast viewers for new episodes is simultaneously being watched by a much larger audience on streaming, largely catching up on episodes rather than watching new ones. One of the more curious things about the show's streaming life is what it has done to the Conway Twitty gags. The original broadcast experience of a Conway Twitty gag required the viewer to either sit through it or change the channel. On streaming, with the ability to skip forward, the gag functions differently. You can bypass it, or you can choose to watch it knowing exactly what it is, which changes the comedic experience in ways the original creators could not have anticipated. The passive coercion of the broadcast gag is gone. What remains is either a deliberate viewing choice or an opportunity to skip. This is a small but genuine example of how the technological context of viewing changes the experience of specific comedy choices. The show has also generated a significant record of formal complaints with regulatory bodies. The FCC received formal complaints about Family Guy content from viewers across multiple seasons, citing indecency, obscenity, and various other categories of broadcast standards violation. The complaints were largely unsuccessful in producing regulatory action, but their volume tells the story of the audience's relationship with the show's content. People who found it offensive complained officially. People who didn't find it offensive watched it in sufficient numbers to keep it on the air. The regulatory body's repeated failure to take significant action against the show established a precedent that influenced what subsequent animated comedies believed they could attempt on broadcast television. Section 15. Quahog's Physics: The Internal Rules and Impossibilities of the Show's Universe. Every fictional universe has its own physics, the rules that govern what can happen, how characters behave, what the world is willing to do. Some shows state their rules explicitly. Family Guy's rules are mostly implicit, sometimes contradictory, and occasionally abandoned in favor of a specific joke that requires violating them. But there is a consistent internal logic to the world of Quahog that becomes visible when you watch enough of the show carefully enough, and it's worth mapping. The most fundamental rule is what might be called the reset principle. Family Guy operates on the assumption that, by the end of an episode, circumstances will return to something approximating the status quo at the beginning. Characters can experience dramatic events, can apparently die and be revived, can have relationships begin and end, can move to different cities and come back, can make promises and break them, can learn lessons and unlearn them. The world of the show is elastically resilient against permanent change. This is not a unique property of Family Guy. Most long-running sitcoms operate on some version of this principle, but Family Guy's version of it is more extreme and more explicit than most. The show has occasionally drawn attention to its own reset behavior, most clearly in the Seahorse Seashell Party episode, which openly dramatizes what happens when the reset mechanism requires a character to sacrifice themselves for it. But the reset principle is not total. Family Guy does have genuine continuity in specific areas. Stewie's teddy bear Rupert is a continuous presence across seasons, and his destruction in a later episode registers as a genuine loss because his presence has been established across years of earlier episodes. Meg ages from season to season, at least in some episodes. Susie Swanson was born and has remained born. She didn't unborn herself the following episode. Brian's various romantic failures accumulate into an implicit character biography across the seasons. The continuity is selective. The show chooses what to remember and what to forget based on what serves the current episode rather than what maintains overall consistency. The question of whether the character's age is one of the show's most pleasingly unresolved puzzles. When Family Guy premiered in 1999, Meg was 16. By 2023, she's still roughly 16. Stewie was born in 1998 within the show's internal logic, which would make him 25 years old by the time season 25 aired. But he's still a one-year-old baby, still in diapers, still building weapons in his crib. The show lives in a permanent present tense where time passes in the world around the characters, they reference contemporary events, they react to current technology. They are affected by things that happen in the real world, while the characters themselves exist in a kind of temporal stasis. This temporal stasis produces specific impossibilities that accumulate across seasons. In one episode, Peter and his friends are shown attending a 1980s high school prom, which would make them somewhere around 50 years old when the show takes place in the 2000s. In another episode, they're in their late 20s or early 30s in flashbacks set 10 years prior. The characters' ages are functionally irrelevant to the show's logic. What matters is that they're adults with children, that they have histories, that those histories can be revealed through flashbacks when the plot requires it. The specific chronology is always in service of the joke rather than the other way around. The show's universe includes a specific and fascinating relationship with death. Characters die and return with a frequency that would be extraordinary in any other show. Brian Griffin died in season 12 and returned 2 episodes later. Various supporting characters have been killed and reappeared in subsequent episodes without explanation. Peter himself has been in situations that would be fatal and emerged battered but functional. The universe's relationship with mortality is more like cartoon logic than realistic drama. Injuries and deaths are real within the context of the scene but rarely permanent across episodes. This is consistent with the show's overall approach to consequence, but it creates specific internal contradictions that the show has occasionally addressed through the time travel mechanics that Stewie's equipment provides. The time travel element, introduced through Stewie's various devices, is one of the show's most significant universe-expanding mechanisms. The existence of functional time travel within the show's world raises questions that the show answers selectively and humorously rather than systematically. Why doesn't Stewie use the time machine to solve all the family's problems? Sometimes he does, and those episodes address the consequences. Why doesn't he use it to complete his plans for world domination? The show's answer, across multiple episodes, is that Stewie has evolved past those ambitions. What about the grandfather paradox? Road to the Multiverse sidesteps it by proposing that time travel in this universe produces parallel branches rather than a single timeline. This is more careful universe building than the show usually gets credit for. The multiverse established in Road to the Multiverse and expanded in subsequent Road to episodes represents the show's most ambitious piece of internal cosmology. The episode visits alternative universes, where history unfolded differently, where Christianity never developed, and the world is technologically several centuries more advanced, where dogs domesticated humans rather than the other way around, where everything looks like a children's sketch, where the animation is Disney quality. Each of these universes has its own visual style and its own internal logic, and the ease with which Brian and Stewie move between them suggests a universe where the barriers between possibilities are permeable in ways that the show's normal episodes mostly ignore. The show's relationship with talking animals is another area where the rules are inconsistently applied. Brian is the only animal in the Griffin household who talks and walks upright. Other animals in Quahog behave as normal animals, except for the times they don't. Stewie has interacted with and been understood by other animals on various occasions. In episodes featuring Brian's fellow dogs, they sometimes talk and sometimes don't. The rule appears to be that animals talk when the plot needs them to and don't when the plot doesn't, which is a reasonable enough approach for a show that values comedy above consistency. The physical impossibilities of the show extend to the characters themselves. Peter Griffin's body, particularly in later seasons, performs feats of physical endurance and recovery that make cartoon logic look conservative. He has been crushed, launched from great heights, driven through walls, and subjected to violence that would require hospitalization for years if applied to a real person. He recovers from most of this within the episode, sometimes within the scene. This is standard cartoon physics, but Family Guy's version pushes further into graphic injury territory than most animated comedies, which creates a specific tension. The injuries look more realistic, the recovery is just as instantaneous. The cognitive dissonance between how serious the injury looks and how quickly it's forgotten is part of a specific kind of humor that the show developed in its middle periods. Brian's status as a dog creates its own physical impossibilities that the show treats with selective attention. He drives, he writes novels, he votes, he pays taxes, he attends plays, he goes to therapy. None of these activities are available to dogs in the real world, and the show knows this, and the show doesn't care, and the show is right not to care because the comedy comes precisely from treating these activities as unremarkable. But occasionally the show remembers that Brian is biologically a dog. and uses that biological fact for comedy. He chases squirrels, he gets excited about car rides, he has specific dog behaviors that surface in contexts where they produce maximum comedic contrast with his usual sophisticated self-presentation. The question of why the Griffin family has a talking dog and treats this as entirely normal is one of the show's most persistent, unasked questions. The show has never explained Brian's origin story in a way that accounts for his specific abilities. He was born in a puppy mill in Austin, Texas. He was taken from his mother by the Griffin family when Peter found him outside the factory. There was no laboratory, no radiation, no magical event, no scientific procedure that would account for his ability to speak, reason, drive, and appreciate jazz. He simply is what he is, and the show has always been comfortable with that. The universe of Family Guy contains a talking, reasoning dog, and it contains exactly one, and the show has never felt the need to explain why. The various ghosts, supernatural entities, and divine figures who appear across the show's run occupy a specific ontological position. God appears as a large man with long hair and robes, living somewhere above the clouds, and has been shown to have romantic interests, make bets, and express emotional reactions to events on Earth. Jesus appears as a contemporary American man, driving a car with the WWID license plate, living a modern life with modern problems. Death, as voiced by Adam Carolla, has a physical form and specific preferences and can apparently be played in a bowling match with stakes attached. The supernatural in Family Guy is extremely material. It has physical presence, personal opinions, and is subject to the same comedic logic as everything else in the universe. Section 16. The music, the songs, and the show's most underappreciated element. When people list the things that made Family Guy memorable, they tend to mention the cutaway gags first, then the specific characters, then the controversies. What they mention less often, and what might actually be one of the show's most genuinely accomplished elements, is the music. Family Guy has produced an extraordinary volume of original musical content across its run, and, at its best, the show's music represents a level of ambition and craft that goes substantially beyond what most animated comedies bother to attempt. The original Family Guy theme song, "It Seems Today That All You See Is Violence in Movies and Indecency on Television," was written by Seth MacFarlane and Walter Murphy, and it establishes the show's relationship with music right from the first episode. The song is a deliberate nostalgic pastiche, evoking the big band production numbers of mid-century American entertainment, which creates an immediately ironic frame for a show that is going to spend the next 22 minutes doing exactly the kinds of things the song is lamenting. The gap between the innocent musical style of the theme and the content of the show itself is the joke, and it's a joke that renews itself every single episode. Walter Murphy is one of the most interesting figures in Family Guy's behind-the-scenes story, and he almost certainly doesn't get enough recognition outside of the show's most dedicated fan community. Murphy is a genuine musical talent whose career long predates Family Guy. He scored the 1976 disco arrangement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, titled A Fifth of Beethoven, which became a significant hit and was prominently featured in the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack in 1977. Bringing that specific combination of classical musical training and pop production sensibility to an animated comedy was a choice that paid extraordinary dividends across the show's run. Murphy's approach to Family Guy's underscore the music that runs beneath scenes rather than being performed as explicit songs gave the show a sophisticated musical texture that most viewers registered without, consciously noting, the background music in Family Guy is more varied and more carefully composed than the production values of the show might suggest. Murphy used different musical idioms for different emotional contexts. Gentle jazz underscore for domestic scenes, dramatic orchestral cues for Peter's more ridiculous adventures, specific stylistic homages when the show was parodying a particular genre or era. The music was doing considerable emotional and contextual work that the comedy depended on. Ron Jones composed music for the show's early seasons before departing, and his work established the musical baseline that Murphy built upon. Jones brought a cinematic scope to the show's musical treatment that matched Family Guy's ambition to be something more than a simple, animated comedy. His contributions to episodes like Da Boom and Road to Rhode Island established a musical vocabulary that gave the show its specific sonic identity. The musical numbers themselves, the episodes where characters break into full song and dance, are the most visible evidence of the show's musical ambition. Road to Rhode Island contains what is arguably the finest single original musical composition in the show's history, a song and dance number performed by Brian and Stewie that functions as a perfect parody of the Hope and Crosby format while also working as a genuine entertainment piece on its own terms. The song's structure, its key changes, its specific comedic lyrical choices, all of these are crafted with the attention of someone who actually understands musical theater, rather than someone who is simply imitating the surface of it. The Stewie solo compositions are another category of musical achievement that the show developed across its run. Stewie's voice, performed by McFarlane, is a genuine singing voice as well as a speaking voice, and the show used this ability extensively. Various Stewie musical numbers across the seasons demonstrate McFarlane's legitimate musical range. The character can sing pastiche, parody, dramatic ballad, and musical comedy with equal conviction. The Brian and Stewie episode from Season 8, which ended with a version of the Elton John song Rocket Man, performed by Stewie alone in the bank vault, used music to express emotional content that the episode's dialogue had been building toward. The song functioned as the emotional resolution of the preceding conversation. The Christmas specials and Halloween specials are where the show's musical ambition most consistently exceeded the format's requirements. Road to the North Pole, with its sustained dark Christmas musical tone, used original songs to reinforce the episode's specific emotional register, a combination of nostalgic warmth, genuine horror, and comedic acceptance of an absurd situation. The musical numbers in that episode don't feel like gags inserted into the story. They feel like the story's natural mode of expression in its most heightened moments, which is what good musical theater does. The Stewie and Brian duets in The Road to episodes and elsewhere explore a specific kind of musical comedy that requires genuine vocal chemistry. McFarlane voices both characters, which means that in recording, he's performing a duet with himself, recording each vocal line separately, and trusting the production process to assemble them into something that sounds like two distinct performers in genuine exchange. The fact that these duets work, that they feel like two different vocal personalities playing off each other rather than one person doing math, speaks to both McFarlane's vocal range and to the editing craft that assembled the final performances. There is a whole genre of fan-made content organized around Family Guy's original songs. YouTube compilations of the show's best musical moments routinely accumulate millions of views. Specific songs, Everything's Better with a Bag of Weed, the FCC song, various Stewie compositions. The Road to episode songs have taken on lives of their own in the fan community, separated from the episodes they came from, and treated as standalone musical pieces. This is a specific kind of cultural impact that most television shows never achieve with their music. People don't generally separate the background music from episodes and compile it on YouTube. The fact that Family Guy's songs work as isolable content, as pieces that hold up when removed from their original context, is evidence of the musical quality that makes them worth separating. The show's parody songs are another dimension of this musical achievement. Family Guy has produced dozens of parody songs across its run, taking existing musical pieces and rewriting them with new lyrics for comedic purposes. The legal and creative process of writing parody songs is more complicated than it appears. It requires both sufficient similarity to the original to be recognizable and sufficient transformation to qualify as parody rather than infringement. The show has navigated this successfully in most cases, producing parody songs that are both clearly derived from their sources and clearly transformed into something distinct. The When You Wish Upon a Weinstein lawsuit, in which the rights holders of the original Pinocchio song challenged Family Guy's parody version, resulted in a ruling in the show's favor that specifically recognized the work as protected parody. That legal outcome validated the creative process that produced the song. The musical score of any individual episode is rarely discussed by critics reviewing animated comedies, which is a gap in the critical conversation about this form. When the New York Times or the AV Club reviews a Family Guy episode, the writing, the voice performances, and the animation might be mentioned. The music is almost never discussed. But for viewers who are paying close attention, for people who notice when the underscore shifts from jazz to orchestral to silence in a way that shapes the emotional content of the scene, the music is doing real work. Murphy and Jones built something that functions largely invisibly, which is probably the highest compliment you can pay to an underscore composer. Section 17. Things that changed television. The show's specific influence and its unlikely ongoing life. To understand what Family Guy changed about American television, you have to place it in its historical moment. When the show premiered in 1999, the animated comedy landscape was dominated almost entirely by The Simpsons. That show had spent a decade defining what adult animated comedy could be: intelligent, character-driven, emotionally grounded, simultaneously broad and specific. King of the Hill had refined the form in a more realistic, naturalistic direction. South Park had pushed the content limits hard in a different direction, toward topicality and willingness to engage directly with current events. What all three of these shows shared was a fundamental commitment to story. The characters existed in recognizable relationships with each other. The episodes built toward something. Consequences, however temporary, occurred. Family Guy arrived with a different set of priorities. It was interested in comedy first, story second, and character development somewhere further down the list. The cutaway format was not just a stylistic choice, it was a philosophical one. It said, the story is not the point is the jokes. The story is the scaffolding that holds the jokes together. This was genuinely different from what the successful animated comedies of the era were doing, and it was genuinely different from what traditional sitcom storytelling assumed was necessary. The Simpsons writing staff had famously resisted any suggestion that their show should use cutaway gags as a regular feature, partly for philosophical reasons about what comedy should be, and partly out of competitive awareness of what Family Guy was doing. South Park's Trey Parker and Matt Stone mounted their famous direct critique in the Cartoon Wars episodes of 2006, depicting Family Guy's writing as literally random idea balls pushed together by manatees with no intentionality behind the connections. The critique was sharp enough that it resonated, and it was also the kind of thing only a competitor who was paying close attention would bother to mount. You don't spend an entire two-part episode attacking something that isn't threatening you. But the critique, while accurate about certain tendencies of Family Guy's weaker episodes, missed something about what the show was actually doing in its better moments. The cutaway gag, when deployed with genuine skill, was not random. It was associative. It worked by the same logic that good comedy has always worked by. The connection between the setup and the payoff was unexpected, but once made, felt inevitable. The early Family Guy cutaways didn't simply cut to something unrelated to the main scene. They cut to something that illuminated the main scene by recontextualizing it, that commented on it through contrast or exaggeration or analogy. The manatee critique was accurate for what the show became in its weaker periods. It was less accurate about what the show was doing when it was working well. The influence of Family Guy on the animated comedy shows that followed it is visible in any number of places. Bob's Burgers, which premiered in 2011 and has been credited by many critics as the finest animated family comedy of the streaming era, drew on some of the emotional warmth that Family Guy had in its early seasons, while largely avoiding the cutaway format in its favor of sustained character interaction. American Dad, as discussed in the transcript, developed directly from the Family Guy universe and demonstrated that the McFarlane production model could sustain a different kind of show, one with more ambitious storytelling and more careful character work. Archer, which debuted in 2009, took the Family Guy approach to pop culture references and self-aware comedy and applied it to a spy thriller context, creating something that felt distinctly of the moment Family Guy had created. The show's influence also extends into live-action comedy in ways that are harder to trace directly but nonetheless real. The specific kind of rapid-fire, reference-dense comedy that Family Guy deployed in its early seasons became part of the vocabulary of American comedy writing broadly. Writers who watched and loved early Family Guy took that sensibility into their work on live-action shows, sketch shows, online content, and their own original projects. The willingness to interrupt a narrative for a brief tangential joke and then return to the narrative as though nothing happened became a recognized and broadly applied technique in comedy writing of the 2000s and 2010s. Family Guy also pioneered what might be called the viral clip economy, before viral clips were a concept anyone had language for. In the years immediately following the show's revival in 2005, YouTube launched and became the dominant platform for user-generated video content. Family Guy's cutaway format was almost tailor-made for this environment. A 3-minute cutaway gag from an episode could be uploaded to YouTube as a standalone piece, shared among friends, watched out of context and still be funny, because the cutaway was designed as a self-contained comedic unit that didn't require the episode around it. Hundreds of Family Guy clips became enormously popular on YouTube in the 2006 to 2010 period, introducing the show to audiences who had never watched a full episode and generating a form of promotion that no advertising budget could have purchased. The relationship between Family Guy and YouTube was mutual and generative. YouTube needed content. Family Guy's format produced content that worked perfectly on YouTube. The show's second wave of cultural penetration, the one that established it with the generation of viewers who were in middle and high school in the late 2000s, happened primarily through viral clips rather than through broadcast television viewing. People in that generation often knew specific Family Guy moments before they knew the show, having seen the clips before ever watching an episode. This was a genuinely new model for how a television show could build and maintain an audience, and Family Guy was one of the first shows to benefit from it at scale. The show's long-running commercial viability, despite declining broadcast ratings, represents something else worth examining: the specific economics that allow an intellectual property to remain commercially relevant long after its primary cultural moment has passed. Family Guy continues to be produced partly because it is cheap relative to live-action television, partly because its library of over 300 episodes generates consistent streaming and syndication revenue, partly because the brand produces merchandise sales that continue regardless of new episode ratings, and partly because it has become, over 25 years, something that new generations of viewers discover and engage with as a piece of culture that exists in the world. Teenagers in 2024 discovering Family Guy on Hulu are discovering a show that their parents watched in its original run, and that temporal layer, the sense of connecting with something that has existed across generations of viewers, is itself a form of cultural value. The show's durability also speaks to something about the specific kind of nostalgia it can generate. Family Guy fans who were teenagers in 2005 are now adults in their mid-30s, and for them the show occupies the same cultural space that early Simpsons episodes occupy for the generation before them. A piece of comedy that was part of the texture of growing up, that carries the specific emotional weight of remembered adolescence. The later seasons may not match what the show was in its prime, but the existence of the early seasons, the 3 pre-cancellation seasons, and the best of the post-revival years gives fans a genuine golden era to return to. And that's not nothing. The show's 25th anniversary, celebrated quietly in 2024, with more attention paid to the mega renewal deal than to the actual anniversary, occasioned some of the more thoughtful retrospective criticism the show has received. Critics who had grown up with the show in the 2000s wrote about it with the specific complexity reserved for things you love that have also disappointed you, things that were formative and that you have complicated feelings about having been formative. The Family Guy anniversary pieces were, more often than not, essays about cultural formation and the specifics of comedy in a particular historical moment, rather than simply assessments of whether the show is currently good. The show had moved, for a significant subset of its audience, from being a television program into being a cultural artifact, something that belongs to a specific time and place in their personal histories. The show's future, locked in now through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 season, is a continuation rather than a reinvention. There are no publicly announced plans to fundamentally change the show's approach, no announced overhaul of the writing staff, no new creative direction, no indication that the people currently running it have identified a way to address the creative challenges that the more critical fan community has been articulating for years. The show will continue to be made. New episodes will air on Wednesday nights and be streamed on Hulu and generate clips for YouTube and TikTok. The machine will keep running. But the machine running is not the same thing as the machine mattering in the way it once did. The show that aired after the Super Bowl in 1999, that got canceled and came back through the collective effort of a devoted fan base, That pioneered the viral clip format and produced some of the most genuinely inventive comedy of the early streaming era. That show was something specific and unusual and worth paying attention to. The show that airs on Wednesday nights in 2025 is something different, something that carries the same character names and the same character designs but has made choices across decades that have taken it somewhere. Its creator probably did not imagine when he was sitting in an RISD dormitory finishing a thesis film about a man named Larry and his talking dog, Steve. Both versions of the show are real. Both of them are part of what Family Guy is. The early seasons and the late seasons, the moments of genuine brilliance and the moments of recycled laziness, the episodes that made a generation laugh in ways they remembered decades later, and the episodes that nobody remembers all of it is Family Guy. The show is both the thing it was at its best and the thing it became when it stopped caring as much about being its best. Most things that last long enough turn into that combination. The history is worth knowing because it explains how the combination happened, and because the best of it is still worth watching, and because the story of how something genuinely new and genuinely vital was made from a student film and a pitch, and a deal and a cancellation, and a miraculous reversal is one of those stories about how creativity works that I don't need to be a fan of the specific thing to find. Interesting. The Griffin family is still at 31 Spooner Street. The Drunken Clam is still open. The beer at the Drunken Clam is still Pawtucket Patriot Ale, brewed at the fictional brewery where Peter Griffin once worked, which produces a fictional beer that has generated more brand recognition than many actual beers. The Giant Chicken is still out there somewhere, nursing his injuries, and waiting for the moment when Peter Griffin appears within range again, and the music will start that specific music, and they'll be at it again, destroying property and each other across locations and decades, for a reason that nobody can entirely remember, but that requires no memory to sustain. Because the fight itself is the reason, and the reason always turns out to be enough. Section 18. Sleep Easy. Final thoughts on a show that never quite made sense and never quite left. There is something genuinely peaceful about spending hours inside the mythology of a show that has this many layers to it. We started tonight at the beginning, a 22-year-old sitting in his RISD dormitory drawing the first version of what would become Peter and Brian. We went all the way through cancellations and revivals, voice actors and their inspirations, hidden jokes in newspaper headlines and sheet music on piano racks, episodes that never aired, predictions that came true in ways that nobody could explain, a baby villain who stopped being a villain, a dog who started out admirable and became something harder to admire, a teenager who absorbed more cruelty than any character in animated comedy history, and somehow remained the most relatable person in the whole show. We traced the Giant Chicken back to an expired coupon, and forward through multiple battles of escalating absurdity. We followed the road to episodes from their beginning as an experiment in whether two incompatible characters would generate chemistry, through their development into the show's most ambitious storytelling format, through the moments where they let Brian and Stewie be fully themselves with each other, honest, loyal, frightened, strange. We looked at the music. At the South Korean animation studios drawing the same characters they've been drawing for 25 years. At the specific mathematics of an industry that keeps making something because it's profitable enough even when it's no longer quite as vital as it was. What Family Guy was, in those early seasons, was rare. A 24-year-old's vision of something specific, not The Simpsons, not Beavis and Butthead, not any of the things that came before it, but something that drew on all of them and made them into something that was clearly its own. The voice was specific. The characters were specific. The humor was specific in a way that required genuine creative intelligence to produce, not just shock and volume. The show that exists now is older and heavier and has made its share of compromises and missteps. But the early seasons are still there. They don't go anywhere. And there's something about settling in with those early episodes or even just spending time in the lore of this universe, in the strange details of how it was made and what it became that has a particular comfort to it, the comfortable feeling of a world that has been fully inhabited. Characters you know well enough that their presence feels familiar even when they're doing something you've never seen before. A sensibility that, at its best, treats the audience as people capable of catching complex jokes quickly and moving on. It's the kind of show that makes very specific, very strange sense at midnight, when you're lying down, when the rest of the world has gotten quiet and there's nothing required of you but to exist somewhere and let the comfortable, strange, Occasionally brilliant mythology of the Griffin family wash past you in the dark. The sheet music above Lois's piano is the actual sheet music for the theme song. Meg's friend request is still unanswered on Lois's Facebook page. Stewie's real voice sounds like Peter. Brian's voice is Seth MacFarlane's natural speaking voice, the voice he actually has, talking the way he actually talks. The giant chicken is still alive. The coupon is still expired. The fight goes on. The sheet music above Lois's piano is the actual sheet music for the theme song. Meg's friend request is still unanswered on Lois's Facebook page. Stewie's real voice sounds like Peter. Brian's voice is Seth MacFarlane's natural speaking voice, the voice he actually has, talking the way he actually talks. The giant chicken is still alive. The coupon is still expired. The fight goes on. There are more facts where these came from, more layers, more strange interconnections between real people and animated characters, more moments where the show was accidentally accurate about things it had no business knowing, more production secrets hiding in DVD commentaries and convention panel recordings and interviews given by people who made something genuinely remarkable and didn't always realize they were doing it at the time. The show has more than 350 episodes at this point. If you watch them all back to back without sleeping, it would take you longer than 2 weeks. That's a lot of fictional Rhode Island. It's a lot of expired coupons and nights at the Drunken Clam, and elaborate plans that Stewie will never quite complete. It's a universe dense enough that you could spend your entire life finding new things inside it. The dedication of the community that has grown around this show across forums and wikis and YouTube channels and fan theories represents an extraordinary collective act of attention paid to something that started as one young man's college thesis and grew into something large enough to sustain decades of devoted scrutiny. The real strange fact at the center of all of this isn't any individual detail about any individual episode. The real strange fact is that a thesis film about a man named Larry and his dog Steve turned into something that people are still discovering, still arguing about, still finding new things inside, 25 years after it first appeared on television following a football game on a January night in 1999. That's the whole story. And it's a good one. Sleep well. If you made it all the way here, thank you. Genuinely. This is the kind of content that takes a very specific kind of viewer to sit with. And the fact that you're still here means something. Drop your location and the time you're watching in the comments. I read all of them. And if you got something out of this, if it helped you relax, if you learned something, if it gave you something to think about, a subscription costs you nothing and helps this channel continue doing exactly this kind of thing. Take care of yourself out there.